Ultra scoffed inwardly, annoyed at how much time Mars was taking just to learn a single skill. But he didn't understand that Mars, the black-haired man, had to work himself to the bone to learn any skill at all. Mars was sitting on the floor, panting, surrounded by hundreds of books and papers. As he tried to focus, he heard Gordon and Ultra whispering outside the door and wondered why they were there. This man was Skill Lender Mars, a member of the famous S-rank party known as the Divine Silver Sword. He grew even more surprised when two girls named Aaliyah and Tina came down the hall and asked what was going on. This made Mars even more bewildered as more people gathered in front of the room where he was. These people were members of the same party. Ultra was a swordsman who possessed countless skills, such as the slashing skill slash attack, the charm Hawk's Eyes, and focused on the Holy Sword's Godspeed sword technique. Aaliyah was a sorceress princess, wielding a knowledge skill that allowed her to use ancient magic with rapid incantations and self-regeneration to be able to use skills in battle. Gordon, a former royal palace gatekeeper, used the hardening skill Obsidian, allowing him to defend like a fortress with physical charms, and the instant footwork skill for high mobility. Tina was the healing saintess, using the recovery skill Wings of the Angel, which could even allow her to resurrect the dead. With such powerful and unique skills, these four created an amazing combination in the S-rank party, alongside Mars. However, Mars felt like a complete nobody because he only had one skill: Skill Lender. Although he used to have others, they were gone because he had lent all of his skills to his party members. For this reason, Mars needed knowledge and training to learn new skills, which is why he had a private study room for himself. However, for some reason, this room had gradually turned into a storage closet. Outside the room, the others began to gossip about Mars, saying that borrowing skills from him was just a waste of time, since Aaliyah still had plenty of skills even without borrowing them. They also said the talent gap between them and Mars was just too wide, and that it would be better if Mars were no longer in the group. They believed Mars was no longer useful or necessary for the party. The black-haired young man sat on his knees, covering his ears, his body trembling with rage as he heard their insulting whispers. Mars took a deep breath and felt that it was time for him to truly leave. 3 years ago, his fate had taken a turn when his party recklessly challenged a high-level dungeon boss without proper preparation. Miraculously, they won, but Ultra and the others believed they had done it with their own strength, refusing to listen to anything Mars said. After that moment, Mars realized the talent gap was real, and he knew there was a chance he would be asked to leave the party after their next labyrinth adventure. Finally, he stepped out of the room and announced that he was done and that he would lend them his skills. However, they all looked at Mars with annoyance because he had taken so long. The black-haired young man bowed his head dejectedly before he began to lend them the 12 skills he had learned. Activating his skill, a brilliant flash of light filled the hallway, and they were prompted to choose the skills. A list of information appeared, beginning to transfer into the other members of the group. When it was over, everyone just glanced at their newly acquired skills and quickly mentioned it was time for them to head into the dungeon. This left Mars utterly crushed. He walked away with a sad expression on his face, because not a single one of them had even said thank you. Mars walked into the dining hall, realizing he had forgotten to eat, while he was busy learning the skills. When he received his food, he saw it had been prepared by his party. But when he opened the bowl, he found only water and a piece of moldy bread from days ago. Ultra laughed loudly at the sight and lied to Mars, saying they were trying to cut costs. However, Mars knew the truth that the group was probably eating meat without him. The next day, the party began their journey to the S-rank dungeon, the Demonic Abyss. Ultra declared he would use the Holy Sword skill and ordered everyone to stay out of its range. He also told Mars to lie on the ground and not move. Aaliyah laughed loudly, saying she expected nothing from Mars other than for him to stay out of the way, and demanded that he not become a burden. The long-haired swordsman activated his skill, and the technique quickly swept through the small monsters ahead. Mars sighed as he witnessed the scene, knowing that the Holy Sword skill wasn't the only one Ultra was using to help him. Learning a skill is like operating a water wheel. The more water, the faster the wheel will turn, and the skill becomes stronger the more it's used. However, unique skills like Mars's skill lending rarely appear between the ages of 8 and 12, and they have distinct properties and effects unlike any other skill. Mars's skill was one of these unique ones, and even when he learned a skill, only other people could activate it perfectly. With the buffs he learned, if Mars swung his sword, the power would be incredibly weak. But if he lent the skill to someone like Ultra, the effect would be 10 times stronger. Mars always thought he had to learn as many skills as possible just to be able to contribute, which led him to work tirelessly until he was invited to the Divine Silver Party because of his skill. Ultra walked up and stomped hard on Mars's head, blaming him for getting the luggage dirty, and yelled at the boy before storming off in a rage. They continued deeper into the dungeon, and Ultra wondered if this was really the S-rank dungeon they had heard about. Ilya agreed, saying that the traps didn't seem to affect them at all. Mars followed behind the group, staring at their backs with a furious gaze. He knew that the floor they were standing on was filled with a paralyzing poison, strong enough to affect even the most powerful individuals. However, thanks to the sacrifices of many, an anti-poison skill had been discovered, and Mars had learned it and lent it to the other members. None of them knew this, and it didn't matter anyway, since they wouldn't listen to Mars if he tried to explain. Arguing was just a waste of time. What was more important for Mars was to maintain a safe distance. While the others joked that he was scared, Mars knew that his protective effect on them would disappear if they got too far away. If Mars were to move just 3 more steps, the 2 people laughing in front of him would collapse from the poison gas, but that didn't bother him. Mars kept his emotions in check. The group suddenly came to a fork in the road, and Ultra yelled, demanding Mars use a skill to help them. Mars explained that there was a skill called Scout's Intuition, but Ultra just kept on yelling, demanding Mars explain every single skill to him, or else he would cut Mars's share of the money. However, Mars knew that Ultra wouldn't listen, but he just kept apologizing without fighting back. Mars thought to himself that he should just pray Ultra's mood was better by the time they returned to the surface. When the swordsman used the skill in question, a large source of energy was felt coming from one of the passages, drawing Ultra's attention. Ilya asked him what he was seeing, and Ultra explained that the door on the right was the correct path, but he also admitted that they were about to face a major enemy. The group finally came upon a large door bearing the symbol of a dragon. Mars stared at it with a mix of fear and excitement. This majestic symbol definitely meant this was the final boss room. And Mars knew that the sacrifices of the many who had died here were not in vain, thanks to the knowledge left behind by those who came before. However, no one else in the group shared that sentiment or thought, as all they cared about was themselves and the fact that they had reached the final boss room. Mars was pulled from his thoughts by Ultra, who said he was going to explain the plan to him. Mars was confused since his only job up until now had been to stay in a corner and do nothing. But Ultra explained that he wanted Mars to have the honor of being the vanguard, sending a shiver of fear down Mars's spine. Being the vanguard meant Mars would have to rush into the boss room first, something he had not expected at all. Mars felt completely alone, and being the vanguard was often a death sentence, especially since dungeons were always unpredictable and he knew how weak he was. He turned to look at the others in confusion, wondering why they would make him do this. Until that moment, Mars realized that Ultra was trying to avoid paying the severance, the payment a person receives when they leave the party. This severance pay increases with each passing year. Mars was at the beginning of his 7th year on the team. Ultra knew the payout would be huge for Mars, because adventuring is a dangerous job. But Mars had reached his limit and couldn't take it anymore. He turned to ask Tina, Gordon, and Elia if they agreed with Ultra's plan, and they all agreed without a moment's hesitation. Mars stood there in shock, unable to believe they could so easily throw away the 6 years he'd spent with them. Everything he had done seemed to mean nothing. Ultra explained that keeping someone without talent was just a burden, and that having Mars on the team was a net loss. He said the whole team had decided that after this dungeon, they would be reborn as a true S-rank party without Mars. Mars lowered his head, a dark shadow falling over his face, as he remembered how he once thought he should support an S-rank party to serve the world and find his own happiness. But from start to finish, that was never true. The black-haired boy listened to almost every word from Ultra until he made one final request. This made Ultra look annoyed. Mars lifted his head, looked at everyone, and asked them to return all the skills they had borrowed. Everyone immediately looked confused, until Mars explained that the skills would become invalid when he died, so he wanted a chance to do some damage to the boss. If this was really his time to die, Ultra laughed out loud before agreeing, and asked what needed to be done to return the skills. Mars activated his skill and said they just needed to say that they were returning the skill one by one. They did as he asked, and within seconds he could feel the return process taking place, hearing the voices of young girls echoing in his head. The group asked if it was done, and Mars confirmed it was. Then he asked if they remembered the interest rate of a skill called Twaichi, and that it had a high interest rate of 10% every 10 days. Aaliyah stepped forward and said she remembered that, claiming it wasn't a problem, because their SP pools were huge. She figured she might lose a skill or two, but believed it would only be ones she rarely used. Gordon and Tina agreed as well, saying they had already calculated the loss of the borrowed skills and saw nothing wrong with what would happen. However, Mars knew that all of them had made a huge mistake. Finally, he told Aaliyah that the skill's interest rate was calculated using compound interest, not simple interest, which confused everyone even more. As the girl was thinking, Mars explained that the base SP remained the same, but every 10 days, another 10% was added to the total. And this interest rate had grown exponentially over the years. Ultra still didn't quite understand the explanation and didn't believe there was a problem. He stepped forward and forcibly took the luggage from Mars's hand so he could fight the boss immediately. Meanwhile, Aaliyah began to recalculate everything, and her eyes widened in horror as she realized just how much they truly had to repay him after all this time had passed. Mars saw the look on Aaliyah's face as she realized the truth and smirked wickedly, knowing this was inevitable from the genius mage. Suddenly, Ultra came up from behind him. Ultra lifted his leg and kicked Mars through the door leading to the boss room. Mars fell face first inside, and as the door began to close, Aaliyah ran towards him, crying out. But it was too late. The door slammed shut, and the process of collecting all the interest from the past 6 years began. Mars felt excruciating jolts of pain shoot through his entire body as the interest collection process took place. He collapsed to the floor, clutching his stomach and head as blood poured from his mouth, feeling his consciousness begin to fade. When a secret safety mechanism was activated, Mars found himself standing in a white void with no clothes on, but he didn't feel cold. He started walking around, realizing he was completely alone in this space, yet he didn't feel anxious. A voice echoed, announcing that the transfer to the protected area had been confirmed, leaving him confused. Mars wondered where he had been transported to, and the voice answered, explaining that this place was the space inside his own mind. His brain had been severely damaged by the enormous amount of skills he had reclaimed. Mars was surprised to learn that he could converse with the skill's voice, and the voice said that its personality had been pre-configured, despite not having a body. Hearing this, Mars asked who had configured it. But the voice didn't answer that question, instead stating that the skill repayment process was nearly complete, and Mars would soon wake up. The voice continued, saying that it had watched over Mars more than anyone else and prayed that from now on, Mars would achieve a future where he could shine brightly. Mars felt emotional, as he had always thought no one noticed his efforts, even when he desperately put others first. But it turned out there had been someone watching over him all along. Mars's brain was now fully healed, meaning he was about to wake up, along with all his new skills. But just before he left, Mars asked for the voice's name. This time he got an answer. Yua. Meanwhile, Aaliyah was desperately pleading with Ultra to enter the boss room immediately. Everyone thought she wanted to save Mars, but she urged them to kill Mars as quickly as possible. Ultra looked down at her in confusion, thinking what she was saying was strange since Mars was going to die soon anyway. Finally, he smirked and said that he knew she was a genius, but they still had something called common sense. However, Aaliyah's body began to weaken, her breathing growing heavy. She collapsed to the floor, drenched in sweat and coughing violently, trying to get out the words that the poison had started to affect her. Everyone was surprised and stared, until they too began to feel the effects of the poison. They all fell to the floor, clutching their bodies. Tina couldn't understand why there was poison here in the first place, and Ultra realized that Tina's Wings of the Angel skill wasn't working. In just a few seconds, the entire party was unconscious on the floor. In the meantime, Mars slowly woke up, realizing that the boss hadn't attacked him at all during that time. Although it felt like a long time had passed for Mars, it had actually only been a brief moment. You look around and realize the room is dark and silent. Mars decides to take a moment to review all the skills he has acquired. To get a better look at his surroundings, he activates the skills God's Eye and Scout's Intuition. He sees a throne up ahead, and there's something sitting on it. A serpentine dragon named Vritra is sitting there. Mars knows that if he doesn't defeat it, the dungeon won't be conquered, and he won't be able to start making serious money with the skills he possesses. Mars recalls some old information that Vritra is a white dragon that cannot be killed by any technique or weapon. However, his train of thought is interrupted as the giant serpent lunges towards him. Mars quickly dodges. It swings its body to attack, but Mars has already prepared a counterattack, and he blocks its attack. As quick as a flash, he grabs its body and hurls it into the wall. If it were an ordinary monster, it would have been dead long ago, but this is no ordinary monster. Yue's voice rings out again, asking if Mars wants to proceed to the next step. Mars agrees immediately and decides to use Elia's skill, Wisdom of the Ancient. Mars raises his hand, and a light envelops his body as he activates the skill, Songs of the God, and learns the skill Cositus, which is amplified by several other skills. As the energy gathers, Mars remembers someone from the past saying that skills are all about controlling this energy. With that in mind, Mars unleashes his attack and blows Vritra to pieces. However, Vritra isn't truly dead and tries to regenerate its body by gathering its fragments. But Mars won't let that happen. He decides to freeze each of Vritra's pieces to seal away its regeneration ability. He uses the skill Spatial Jump to extend the range of his ability out into the world, and even into the cosmos, a place known as the Ocean of Stars, before sending Vritra's body parts into the endless darkness, where it will take 1,000 years for the ice to melt. As the dungeon begins to collapse, it signifies that it has been conquered. Mars notices that Ultra and the others are still paralyzed by the poison, but he believes the mining team can probably help them before the dungeon completely collapses. Just before Mars leaves after collecting the materials from the boss, he notices something is still left in the room, a Vritra egg. Mars picks up the egg and considers destroying it. But then he figures that the only thing that can stop a Vritra is another Vredra. He decides to raise the monster when it hatches, and he asks Yue if she has any objections. The voice doesn't object, but respects Mars's choice, saying that this is very interesting. Mars gives a sly grin, feeling like this is the first time anyone has ever said that to him. He proceeds to use Spatial Jump to escape the dungeon, and this is the first time Mars has ever escaped entirely on his own. Mars was the first of the group to escape the dungeon, emerging under the blue sky. Afterwards, he treated himself to a warm bowl of soup without anyone yelling at him. Mars placed Vritra's egg, the item he had found and brought back from the dungeon, into a large bag, then put his hands on his hips, staring at the town he had long been a part of. A gentle breeze blew through the air, and the black-haired boy knew it was time for him to leave and start a new journey elsewhere. Ultra and the others were still underground, but Mars had already completed the procedures to withdraw from the guild and received his severance pay along with his reward. Before leaving the inn, he called out to Yue and said that he wanted to create a body for her. Yue responded, trying to tell Mars that she believed a beautiful girl would come to him one day. However, Mars explained that she had misunderstood. He just wanted to thank Yue for helping him all this time. Mars asked Yue what she wanted her body to look like. After a moment of hesitation, Yue was silent for a moment before admitting that she wanted to be able to touch Mars with her own hands, and asked if that was possible. Mars knew that creating life from scratch was impossible, but while in the protected area, he realized that some skills could create a body without a consciousness. This time, however, a consciousness was already present thanks to Yue, which might allow Mars to transfer her into a body. Mars activated the skill lender and took Tina's skill, Wings of the Angel, then evolved it into Blessing of the Seraph. This evolution was enough to create a complete human being from scratch. He told Yue to get ready to transfer into the real world, and she complied, adjusting every muscle fiber of the new body. Mars raised his hand, and the body of a woman began to form from thin air. The process was quickly completed, and Yue, in her new form, silently leaned against Mars, before her eyes slowly opened. For the first time, she spoke, and asked Mars if she could ask 2 questions. Mars set her down and agreed to answer. Yue explained that she had only called Mars person all this time, and asked what she should call him now that she had a body in the real world. Mars said his name was enough, but Yue believed that wasn't appropriate, as Mars was her creator and master according to the information she had gathered from the past. Yue decided to call Mars master and struck a cute pose as she did so, prompting Mars to quickly ask her to just say master normally. After realizing that the memory Yue had accessed was from when Gordon snuck into a maid cafe, Mars started to feel flustered. Yue's second question was about her lack of clothes, which made Mars panic for forgetting such an important detail. This not only affected the body, but the armor also increased recovery ability thanks to the healing skill, Wings of the Angel, which had been enhanced by the range enchantment spell. But he couldn't create them from thin air. Mars quickly searched through his inventory and found a spare set of clothes for Yue to wear, though she said she didn't mind being as she was. Yue smiled happily, admitting that the clothes smelled just like her master, which made Mars chuckle lightly. But he also reminded her not to express herself like that in the human world. Since Yue still had little sense of reality, the two of them would need to learn slowly together. With that settled, the two began their new journey to find a place to raise Vritra. They needed to find a place far from the city, as Vritra was a giant serpent and Mars was tired of socializing. Before they left, Yue ran into a small problem, as she didn't know which foot to step forward with first. And Mars knew this journey would be a long one with this girl in tow. Besides that, Mars had collected 2 unique skills from the Sword of the Divine Silver Party, leaving only Ultra's Sword Saint and Gordon's Obsidian skills. But there was no need to rush. He would take back what was his. Meanwhile, Ultra and the others were drinking at a bar. Ultra, with his long hair, was bragging about how he had used his skill to slice the frozen giant serpent into pieces, until Mars betrayed the whole party, ruining their intended glorious victory. All of this was a blatant lie, but Ultra still tried to maintain his false facade. Model. When people asked about the final boss's body, everyone around them started wondering how Mars could have defeated 4 S-rankers, and they began discussing the possibilities. However, luckily for Ultra, they still believed his party was stronger than Mars, and that there must be some other explanation. Tina was impressed by how easily Ultra's lies were believed. However, what Ultra cared about right now was where Mars was. The 4 of them were found by the mining team a week ago, but Mars had left the city 3 days before they woke up, and had already reported the situation to the guild. Ultra grew even angrier hearing this from Tina, and started yelling at a waitress for more beer. Tina told him to stop being so rude, as it could damage her reputation and cause trouble with the church. In his rage, Ultra took his anger out on Alaya, who was quietly eating her bread. When Ultra yelled at her, demanding she say something, Alaya simply pretended to go along with him, and said that eating bread dipped in corn soup was amazing. Ultra was confused by Alia's unexpected response, though he also agreed that the food was delicious. However, Alia continued to eat happily, humming to herself and making a mess, which only confused Ultra more. Everyone said Alia was a genius who had once written a thesis on the multidimensional interpretation of indeterminate sound, and possessed a unique intellect that had stirred the academic world. But right now, there seemed to be no trace of that intelligence in the girl. As the situation started to feel off to Ultra, Mars and Yue were walking along the vast roads crossing the lands. Mars was explaining the world to Yue, like who Dukabik was and what he did. He asked Yue if she was used to walking, and Yue confirmed she was, though she was still getting used to walking on paths that weren't main roads. Mars explained that main roads were expected to be safe and comfortable, as they connected towns and were used by many people, including lords, and were also related to taxes. Yue curiously asked what taxes were, and Mars explained that it was money used to support things like dispatching soldiers to eliminate monsters. One of the towns built to generate this revenue was Kanui, the town they were approaching, with a population of about 100 people. Suddenly, Yue called out to him, and Yue went on to ask if their story was contradictory, as she looked behind them and saw the dead following them. There were zombies, poison cats, night hounds, and even fire slimes. During their night camp, they could have easily used the spatial jump skill, but Mars wanted to take the time for Yue to learn about everything. Mars had heard that people with skills often emitted a unique mana, and he was beginning to believe that his amount of SP was attracting the monsters. However, Yue heard his thoughts and reassured him it was fine, since they could just repel the monsters with their skills. Yuke was impressed and praised Mars for his creativity in activating spatial jump around their tent, which sent the monsters flying into the air only to fall back to the ground. However, Mars was still worried about the number of monsters, and said they should hurry on their way to their destination, the town of Kanui, a place where adventurers mostly rested during their travels. The atmosphere here was very different from the towns they had passed through. At a restaurant, Mars bought a baked sweet for Yue, but their exploration was interrupted by the sight of a girl falling to the ground and being yelled at by a man for being lazy. Mars was surprised when he noticed the girl's ears and tail, realizing she belonged to a special race, a werewolf. Yue asked if werewolves were rare, and Mars confirmed, explaining that they originally lived in the forests around this area until a war with humans drove them from their lands. The surrounding grasslands were once a forest, but after the war, it fell into human hands, was deforested, and abandoned. The one who took over and developed this ruined land was Dukabik. Werewolves were beings of superior strength in the forest, with sharp fangs and claws, bodies covered in fur, and blessed by the wolf god, making them a proud race. Yue asked if that girl was really part of the werewolf race Mars had heard about in stories, and Mars began to believe that the legends might be far from reality, Mars wondered why a descendant of the werewolves was being treated like a slave, thinking that losing the war might have made them even lower than humans. The man from before came in and called everyone for lunch. The werewolf girl got her portion, for having completed her morning quota, but the meal was just a bowl of thin soup and a piece of dirty bread. This was the same kind of food Mars used to receive when he was with the Sword of Divine Silver group, and it was clear the other workers had better quality meals than the girl. Yui understood what was going through Mars's mind and advised him that if he wanted to help someone right in front of him, he shouldn't be afraid to act. Those words were enough to motivate Mars to intervene, even if it meant staying in town for another 10 days. Mars asked to see the boss in his office, and after talking for a while, he approached the werewolf girl. He said he had heard her story and knew her pay was 3,000 yen each time she moved all the wheat sacks into the warehouse. But he also knew that the amount of work she had to do couldn't possibly be finished in a single day. The girl said that 300 yen was deducted each day for food, and Mars interrupted, pointing out that amount was only enough for the thin soup. These words made the girl glare at him and ask what he wanted from her. Mars was impressed by the girl's strong, determined gaze. Despite her terrible situation, her eyes still held a piece of the pride Mars had heard about in the legends of the werewolves. Initially, Mars had planned to just give her some money and leave, but he decided to do something different. He proposed that the girl give him 600 yen from her wages, and in return, she would earn 10 times the amount she was currently making. Mars had heard that her skill was strengthening her legs, and he offered to extend the skill's duration for several weeks, allowing her to finish transporting all the wheat sacks by the next day. She sat in silence, thinking over the offer, while Mars continued to explain, drawing the cost on the ground and asking if she understood the numbers. This offended her, as she thought he was underestimating her. And Mars realized she had been properly raised, which made him wonder even more why she was in this situation. He began to wonder if someone was taking advantage of her. After Mars explained the exchange in detail, he left the decision to her. However, the girl replied that she could finish the job faster even without taking his money. Mars knew that not taking money from her wasn't how he wanted things to go, but he agreed anyway. He told Yue to prepare for the skill transfer process. He activated the skill lender skill and began the lending process, realizing at the same time that he needed a name to introduce himself. So he introduced himself as Mars and asked for her name. She replied that her name was Shizuku. Mars lent Shizuku the skill Extend Duration, and she stood up in surprise, immediately feeling the change in her body. After the process was complete, Mars gave her a pastry that he and Yue had bought from a local shop as a gift to seal their deal. When Mars asked if Shizuku's lunch break was over, she was startled and hurried off to get back to work. Yue witnessed this and asked Mars why he charged the girl instead of helping her for free. Mars explained that Shizuku still had her pride, and she wouldn't accept help if it was an act of pity. Later that day, Shizuku finished her work quickly and went to collect her pay. On her way out, she thanked Mars. Mars thought about her potential and reminded her to find a better job and earn a lot of money by the 10th day, when she had to repay the loan. Shizuku gave Mars the 600 yen as promised, but she didn't seem very happy and left with a forced smile. The next day, Mars and Yue were walking through the streets after doing some shopping. As they passed an alley, they saw a figure. It was Shizuku, desperately chewing on a plant near a puddle of water, which confused Mars as he didn't understand what she was doing. Meanwhile, Ultra and the others were in a tavern. But Ultra seemed more irritable than usual. He was thinking that he wouldn't be able to calm down if he couldn't get the reward for the conquest. Ultra wondered how Mars was still alive and how the dungeon was conquered after they had all been paralyzed and knocked unconscious. In the midst of his anger, Gordon walked in with good news. His forehead sweating after a long run. Gordon said that his legs felt heavy and he had become slower, and Ultra thought that maybe it was time to get rid of him. However, pushing those thoughts aside, Ultra asked why the guild had summoned them this time, and Gordon announced that Duca Beak had found out they had supposedly conquered the demon's abyss and was inviting them to prove their skills. Ultra calmed down and slammed his beer mug on the table, confident that their path to becoming true S rank was still wide open. For years, the Sword of Divine Silver Party had been at the top because of their achievements, and now it was time for them to reclaim their fame and prestige. Ultra slammed his hand on the table and declared to everyone that they would finally have a chance to build connections, and could even become nobles if they wanted. He was starting to feel that kicking Mars out of the party was the right decision, because Ultra didn't want to keep any incompetent people in the group. Ultra heard that the land they were heading to was the result of a war against a demi-human race, which made him speculate that the Lord of House Abik might be a combat-oriented person. Therefore, Ultra suggested they showcase his Sword Saint skill, and on top of that, they could also show off Tina's Wings of the Angel skill. However, Tina quickly said that Ultra's skill alone would be enough, but her worried tone made Gordon feel that something was off. Ultra sat there with a malicious smile, believing that the Sword of Divine Silver would never fail, as long as his Sword Saint skill remained. Ultra's Sword Saint skill focused on speed, but without the dynamic vision skill that Mars had lent him, what would happen? The party wouldn't realize that Ultra had lost his Hawkeye skill for another 10 days. Mars and Yue focused on Shizuku, the werewolf girl, who was sitting in the alley. When she spotted them, she panicked and quickly tried to run away, dropping the rotten roots she had been eating. Mars knew that this type of plant could be used as emergency food, but if eaten in excess, they were poisonous and would cause one's hands to rot. That's how these things got their name. Mars wondered why she had to eat this plant when she should have been paid just the day before. He quickly realized something, and told Yue to find Shizuku while he went to see the man who had hired her. Mars meets the bald man, who claims that he paid Shizuku fairly but only 600 yen, because he had to cut costs to keep his business running. After an argument, Mars realizes that the real reason he cut her pay was because she's a werewolf. This gives Mars a new perspective on how some humans exist in this world. Just like his former comrades, they are willing to take advantage of and exploit others for their own benefit. And if those people are no longer useful, they're willing to abandon them. But this bald man is different. He exploits the kindness of others for his own gain. The bald man tells Mars that his thinking is clever and demands payment for the information he provided about Shizuku. However, as Mars takes out the money, a shadow falls over his face, and he tells the bald man to hold out his hand. Mars drops the money into the man's hand, and then activates his skill, Spatial Rupture, instantly severing the man's hand and sending the money scattering everywhere. A scream echoes throughout the building as the bald man realizes his hand has been cut off and falls to the floor, crying out in pain. But Mars shows no mercy, picking up some of the money from the floor and placing it in the man's remaining hand, asking why he couldn't hold on to the money he loves so much. Mars stands tall as the bald man, drenched in sweat, looks at him in terror, asking what he's done. Mars stomps on the man's severed hand and asks if he knows what Shizuku ate that day. But the bald man doesn't understand what Mars is talking about and says he doesn't care. Mars knows that reasoning with this man is pointless, and the only way for someone like him to understand his actions is to make him taste the consequences of exploiting others like Shizuku. Even so, Mars believes that Shizuku has no intention of paying her debt or standing up to this man on her own. Although Shizuku still promised to pay Mars, this means Mars is willing to fight on her behalf. Mars lost his pride and honor long ago, but now he feels a responsibility to confront this man. The bald man says that Mars has no right to do what he's done, but Mars thinks otherwise since this man didn't pay Shizuku properly and used the excuse that she didn't deserve to be paid like a human because she's a werewolf. Mars moves closer, making the man scream in fear and back away. Mars explains that he has invested his skills in Shizuku, and now he's here to collect the profits from that skill. The bald man keeps screaming that the money is his, but is cut off when Mars picks up his severed hand and asks for confirmation whether the pay was really reduced from 3,000 yen to 600 yen. Mars tells the man that reducing the pay to 1/5 will be met with the severing of his left hand and both of his legs, and that he can heal them as many times as he wants. This causes the bald man to start panting in fear. Suddenly, the walls of the building collapse, and all the townspeople can see what's happening inside. The room was in total disarray with money scattered all over the floor, and the bald man's predicament was exposed for all to see. The bald man continued to pant in fear as Mars drew closer, saying they could continue their conversation. Mars reminded the man that he wasn't making empty threats, but he knew that controlling others through fear wasn't the method he wanted to use. However, he wanted this man to regret his actions. If regret was even an emotion this man was capable of feeling. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. It was Yue who had brought Shizuku and was asking what Mars needed to do next. The room was half destroyed and everyone outside could see in, but from Mars's perspective, it still made sense to use the door. Mars decided to activate his skill, Blessing of the Seraph, and regenerated the bald man's arm, before allowing the two girls to enter. The door fell down easily as the entire room was already destroyed. Shizuku, the werewolf girl, was surprised by the wrecked state of the place. Mars asked how she was feeling, and Shizuku timidly replied that she was fine, before asking what had happened. Mars didn't answer Shizuku's question, and instead turned to Yue, who reported that the werewolf girl had only consumed a small amount of the poison. Mars felt relieved, and then turned back to face the bald man, asking about the money again. Fortunately, the man had a quick change of heart and bowed before Mars, admitting that he had paid Shizuku unfairly. Mars bent down and said that the man would have to provide Shizuku with medicine and food. Then Mars took a bag of money and pulled out a gold coin, handing it to Shizuku, which was worth up to 100,000 yen. The werewolf girl was taken aback by such a large sum of money, while the bald man was confused, not expecting Mars to take only such a small amount. Mars returned the bag of money to the man. Seeing the bewildered look on the bald man's face, Mars explained that if he took any more, he would be no different from this man. Realizing something, Mars then offered one of his own coins to the bald man, saying it was to cover the cost of repairing the office. However, just before handing over the coin, Mars activated his skill, Six-Armed Ashura, and threw the coin at high speed toward the bald man. The coin struck him hard on the forehead, causing him to cry out in pain. Mars turned his back, saying that all debts had been paid, while the bald man clutched his head, sitting up with tears welling in his eyes. The man glared after Mars with resentment. Mars was probably hoping the short man would come after him. As Mars, Yue, and Shizuku left with the money in hand, people started running over to the bald man to ask if he was okay. He shook his head to clear the pain, looking up with a furious expression, veins popping on his neck. He ordered everyone to call a foreman named Eldro immediately. Mars told the two girls that they should get cleaned up and buy some new clothes, as there was no reason for them to keep wearing what they had on. He activated his storage skill and put away the large bag he was carrying, then led the two to a bathhouse to get all of them cleaned up, and then to a clothing store to pick out more comfortable and presentable outfits. Finally, they arrived at an inn to rest for the night. Mars was surprised by how different Yue seemed as he watched her help Shizuku, the werewolf girl, into her new clothes. Shizuku said it was the first time she had ever worn clothes like these, and Mars couldn't believe he had once mistaken her for a boy. Mars called Shizuku over and asked if she really liked the clothes she was wearing. The small girl began to stammer and get flustered, wondering if his question meant they looked strange on her. Mars reassured her that wasn't the case and said she didn't need to hold back and should just choose clothes with more fabric. Yui explained that the choice of outfit wasn't to save money but was mainly because of the design. Mars joked that he was just teasing her. He put the jokes aside and told Shizuku that the clothes looked great on her. This made her even more shy and flustered, tugging at her ear as she thanked him for the compliment, while also explaining that she liked the style of these clothes. Mars suddenly changed the subject, asking Shizuku about the bald man and why she backed down from him after not being paid properly. He wondered why she didn't try to demand the money she was owed, even when she was eating rotten blades of grass because she had no money. Mars tried to advise her that he thought she could win if she fought, but Shizuku finally spoke up, explaining that the werewolf race cannot use their power for themselves, no matter how strong the opponent is, or how frustrated they feel. The small girl suddenly showed her determination, declaring that if she found someone worthy to risk her life for, only then could she use the power of the wolf. Mars gave a small smile and told Shizuku that she was truly strong, before slowly getting up, feeling excited to see the legend of the werewolves unfolding right before his eyes, whether Shizuku was covered in mud or eating poisonous grass. She would never lose her pride. Mars stood in front of her and calmly asked for confirmation about her using her power for someone. Shizuku replied that she could, but then she asked why he was wondering about that. Just then, Mars quickly explained that a group of armed men was heading to the inn. Thanks to his perception skill, he could see about 40 men wearing armor and carrying weapons. He wondered if this was the group of mercenaries that was in the city, but most importantly, the one leading the group was the man who had hired Shizuku, who was standing next to the foreman, likely with the intention of getting revenge on Mars for what he did to the bald man. This information caused a surge of rage to well up inside Shizuku. Mars called Shizuku's name. Mars asked if he could be that person for her, and she agreed immediately as she would not forget the kindness he had shown her. With this in mind, they prepared to face the threat ahead. Mars believed the right decision was to fight, since the werewolf girl could also join in. He asked her if the temporary enhancement skill he had lent her would be enough, and Shizuku was confident it would be. However, Yue felt that it would be too dangerous for her if her skill was only a leg enhancement. Mars wasn't worried at all and reassured Yue as he already knew the situation. He turned to Shizuku and asked her to confirm that her skill wasn't a leg enhancement. She was silent for a moment in surprise and asked how he knew beforehand. Mars explained that the information he heard from her didn't seem too complex, which meant that she might be hiding the true power of her secret skill, and had deceived everyone by saying she was just a child or a demi-human. Shizuku apologized for lying and explained that in reality she couldn't use the skill for long, and she hated being taken advantage of by others if they knew about her skill. Mars asked her to show him the skill, and she hesitated for a moment before nodding, and immediately powered up, a brilliant light surrounding her body as Shizuku called upon the spirits of her ancestors to bless her with their power. Both Mars and Yue watched in amazement as they witnessed Shizuku activate her skill, Armor of the Fanged Wolf. As the skill activated at full power, energy claws formed around her hands. It was then that Mars realized that the legends of the werewolf's unparalleled power in the forest were true. With fangs and claws and a body covered in fur, blessed by the wolf god. Without another word, the werewolf girl declared that she would go, then stormed out of the room with a determined expression, ready to fight every single person outside with her true power. The group of mercenaries continued moving down the street until a flash of light erupted, sending a number of them flying into the air. As the bald man and the other four looked on in confusion, the bald man finally realized who had caused the chaos. It was Shizuku, who knew they had come for Mars. She asked them if they wanted money, a woman, or Mars's life. Two of the men laughed loudly and told her to cut it out, as the four of them explained that they wanted everything from Mars. Shizuku bowed her head in disappointment at that response, before the foreman pulled out a long whip, believing the werewolf girl was trying to intimidate him with the light surrounding her body. If these guys came to take everything from Mars, then Shizuku would take everything back from them. The foreman dared her to try, and he started lashing the whip towards her, saying he would teach her how to count with his strength-enhanced whip. However, before the man could even finish his sentence, Shizuku lunged forward. This caught the manager by surprise, and he broke into a nervous sweat as the werewolf girl repeated his own words back to him about learning how to count. She threw a punch into his stomach and shouted the first count, as blood sprayed from his mouth. The foreman roared in pain, clutching his chest and stomach as he jumped back to create some distance from the small werewolf girl. But Shizuku didn't falter. She charged forward again, kicking him in the face before he could react, and continued her count. Mars sat quietly by the window, letting Shizuku fight on her own, because this was her battle, not his. He began to wonder why she wasn't using her claw skill, and questioned whether it was out of Shizuku's hatred or simply her compassion. The girl told the foreman that he could count to 100 billion, meaning this fight could go on forever until he either surrendered or was forced into submission by Shizuku's hand. He lay on the ground, clutching his bleeding face, roaring in anger and asking why she was so strong. He believed the girl was merely a dog with terrible skills. Unable to accept the situation unfolding before him, he slammed his fist into the ground in a fit of rage. Mars noticed the man's emotions but knew that all his words were meaningless. He recalled his conversation with the foreman's boss, and on that day he had finally understood. After talking with the bald man, whose name seemed to be Garen, Mars realized that people like this only thought Shizuku didn't fight back because she was weak, and couldn't imagine any other reason. That was what was happening to this man. He couldn't comprehend and accept the situation. Honor and goodwill are one thing, but there are those who use their power for evil. To them, if you can't fight back, it means you're stupid and weak. And to Ultra and the others, Mars must have seemed like one of those stupid people and a weak creature. What Shizuku was doing right now was carving her message into her enemy's body, that they had made a huge mistake, and that she was stronger than they could possibly imagine. This was the first time Mars had witnessed a special skill being used firsthand, especially with this level of power that only a select few could possess. Shizuku had a special skill based on her personal abilities and her own training. This made Mars realize that the skills people normally had might just be the beginning, and what Shizuku was demonstrating was the fruit of her relentless effort. Yue looked on at the battle with admiration, asking Mars if Shizuku's skill was different from a unique skill. Mars confirmed that it was. He realized that Yue didn't know about this type of skill because they were only mentioned in skill books. He explained that Shizuku's skill was a special skill, a skill that anyone could achieve through training, regardless of race or class. These skills could be found in many places, but there was still a type of skill that only a lucky few possessed. Mars looked at Shizuku with respect. He understood that she was not just a warrior but a symbol of perseverance and strength that everyone could strive to achieve, as well as the overwhelming power that came from her skill. Mars felt proud witnessing the progress of Shizuku, someone he had helped. She was not only showing her strength but also her indomitable will, which made him feel happy. As the battle unfolded, Mars could feel Shizuku's power surging, and he knew that no one could stop her when she fought with all her might on this land. Shizuku poured all her energy into her attacks, striking fear into the enemies who tried to approach. Mars also felt a rush of excitement, and decided that he wouldn't just stand by on the sidelines. He felt that this was the time to show his own strength and support Shizuku in battle. Although Shizuku had demonstrated incredible strength, Mars knew that there might be greater challenges waiting ahead, and he couldn't let her face them alone. With resolve, Mars stepped into the battle beside Shizuku, ready to fight to protect his new friend and prove that the power of friendship could overcome any challenge. Mars felt worried. As he witnessed Shizuku's anger erupt, the scream, "Give it back to me," echoed in her head, like a cry from the depths of her soul. He knew that this anger didn't just come from being mistreated, but also from a deep pain she had been forced to endure. As Shizuku went berserk and threw herself into the fight, her power increased significantly, reaching level 4064. The enemy she faced couldn't stand against her fury, and in just a few seconds they were easily defeated. The sight of bodies flying through the air and blood pouring from their armor left Mars stunned. Still enraged, Shizuku screamed, "Give it back to me!" Garen, the bald man who had unfairly paid Shizuku, was now trying to flee while the other mercenaries became decoys for Shizuku's frenzy. Mars realized it was time for him to intervene and help. He told Yue they should go immediately, as Mars had an idea of where Garen had fled. He activated his spatial jump skill and quickly teleported back to the destroyed building they had left earlier, arriving before Garen could. Garen, looking exhausted from running, was shocked to see Mars and Yue there. Mars mocked him, saying he was slow and needed to exercise more. But Garen was only focused on worrying about how the two of them had appeared there. Mars understood that Garen was looking for something in the space beneath the ground. He was bewildered, not understanding how Mars could have known that. But Mars reminded Garen about how he had buried his own severed arm underground before Shizuku and the others arrived. The reminder left Garen confused and panicked. Mars knew he wouldn't escape easily and was determined not to let Garen get away with his cruel actions. He was ready to face his enemy and do whatever it took to protect Shizuku and other vulnerable people. If a person makes a mistake entering coordinates when using the spatial jump skill, there's a chance they could get stuck inside a wall. Therefore, using a perception skill to scan the destination is crucial. At the time Mars buried his arm, he realized there was a strange amount of space underground, which meant there was likely a hiding spot for Garen. Garen, drooling with anger, asked if Mars was trying to stop him from escaping. Shizuku calls Mars a demon, and Yue asked Mars if Garen was joking. Mars replied that it was better if she thought so. He turned back to look at Garen and tried to explain to the short man that he would die whether he ran or fought, because it would be like a house of straw to Shizuku. Just one blow and it would all be over. The mercenaries were fighting because they were paid. But Garen was different. He was just a civilian. If Shizuku did something terrible to that short man, it would be considered a crime. These words made Garen think Mars intended to protect him, but that wasn't the case at all. Mars was determined that a cruel man like Garen deserved no protection, and he was prepared to do whatever it took to ensure justice for people like Shizuku. Yue asked if Garen's current words were a joke, and Mars agreed, leaving the short man confused about the situation. Mars then ordered Garen not to move a single step, because Shizuku was on her way. Mars asked Garen if he'd forgotten about his skill, that he could regenerate a severed arm. This meant Mars didn't care what happened to Garen, since he was certain he could just restore him later. Shizuku arrived just a few seconds later with a blank expression and a mana level of 81,937. As soon as the wolf girl appeared, Garen tried to beg Mars for help, but he didn't move an inch, just watching with a bored expression as Shizuku unleashed her anger on him. Screams of pain and fear echoed through the building, and finally the battle was over. 3 days later, Mars and the others were walking through town trying to keep a low profile, because it seemed every citizen was paying attention to them, but not for negative reasons. An elderly man approached and asked if the three of them needed to go anywhere, but Mars declined, saying the place they wanted to go was just around the corner. Mars felt exhausted from so many people talking to him, and wondered how many times it had happened that day. Yue was there to the rescue, and she answered that it had been 8 couples and 14 individuals. Right after Shizuku defeated Garen's group, people discovered nearly 40 mercenaries brutally beaten in the streets, causing a huge shock in Kinui. People could only talk about how Garen had fought a great traveler but was ultimately defeated by that same traveler. The town returned to peace after this rumor spread. This wouldn't have been a problem if it weren't for people constantly interacting with them. They were greeted by townspeople and asked about the weather. Some came to ask about the powerful skill that took down the group of mercenaries. And someone even seemed to be asking if Mars had a girlfriend, but quickly backed off when they saw the two women with him. Even though he didn't answer the questions, people still bothered them, taking the rumors too far or looking at the three of them with more favorable eyes. It was all because of Garen. Mars wondered what that bald guy had done to make everyone hate him so much. The wolf girl couldn't understand the reason. Why Mars wanted to spend money instead of saving it. Mars explained that spending money locally would help boost the town's economy, which could help Shizuku and others in the future. Shizuku looked at Mars with bright eyes, sensing the sincerity in his words. She couldn't help but feel warmed by the idea that despite all the hardships, there were still people like Mars willing to help. Yue also felt convinced. Shizuku asked what their plan was. Mars replied that they could buy food, clothes, and other necessities for their journey, while helping the local people at the same time. Shizuku nodded in agreement, finally feeling like she could contribute to the community, even though this place didn't leave her with good memories after everything that had happened. But Yue didn't see it that way. She wanted him to think more about himself. Mars believed that he didn't want the people here to suffer because of any one individual's mistake. Yue quickly agreed with his decision, even though she didn't fully understand its meaning. With this decision, they began to plan their shopping, and Shizuku felt more excited than ever. Not just for the new things, but also for the chance to do something positive for others. Mars used the skill Spatial Jump to move, and the place they arrived at was a jewelry store. The werewolf girl quickly realized this was the only store in town where they could spend 700 million in a single purchase. She had never stepped into such a luxurious place before. Mars had never been to a place like this either, and the three of them stepped inside the jewelry shop. A girl with long black hair greeted them. Mars placed the bag of money on the table to the black-haired girl's surprise. He requested to find jewelry suitable for all three of them, which surprised Shizuku. The black-haired girl looked at the money and thought for a moment. She turned away and promised to find items suitable for the 747,631,000 yen he had. Mars stared blankly at the girl's back as she disappeared behind a curtain. When the long-haired woman returned, on her hands was a tray with sparkling jewelry. These were 3 jade necklaces that originated from the queen of the werewolf tribe. This detail caught Shizuku's attention. Meanwhile, Yue was drawn to the fact that they were the queen's gems. The queen's gems possessed a stronger mana than any other type of gemstone. The long-haired girl had also heard about their identities and knew Shizuku was from the werewolf tribe, so she thought this would be a suitable item for them. Mars offered one to Shizuku, but she refused because the gift was too expensive. But in the end, she relented and put it on. Shizuku suddenly asked him a question. Mars looked at Shizuku with surprise as she led him out of the jewelry store. The wolf girl with a shy expression was flustered, not knowing how to express her intentions. Mars? Shizuku began, her voice soft. I want to thank you for everything you've done for me. Mars smiled, happy to hear her sincere thanks. There's no need for that, Shizuku. I just did what I felt was right. You deserve better. But Shizuku still couldn't shake the feeling of wanting to repay him. I know, but it really meant a lot to me. I want to be able to do something for you. Mars sensed the sincerity in her words, and it made him think. If you want to do something, then have confidence in your abilities and keep moving forward. That's the best way to thank me. Shizuku nodded, but her eyes still shone with determination. I want to help you in any way I can. I don't want to just be someone who receives help. With this bond, Mars felt more excited about their journey. Together they would do great things, and Mars knew that Shizuku would not only be a companion but also a powerful warrior in the future. Hearing about the faraway Azure dungeon, Mars felt intrigued. An S-rank dungeon could offer many opportunities and valuable rewards. If it's an S-rank dungeon, then I'll have to prepare very carefully, he replied, deciding quickly. I'll help you. This was the only thing Shizuku could ask him for help with. Seeing Mars's attitude, Shizuku quickly apologized. Thinking this made him uncomfortable, Shizuku pleaded, tightly gripping Mars's hand. Tears began to stream down her face. Mars looked into Shizuku's tear-filled eyes, feeling the urgency in her voice. You want me to go to Hidden Wolf Alley and help save it? He asked, his heart filled with determination. Yes, Mars. My hometown is in danger. A terrifying monster has appeared in the area, and only someone like you can help us. A feeling of joy spread through Shizuku, and she couldn't hide the smile on her face. Thank you, Mars. I knew you wouldn't let us down. Meanwhile, Ultra and his group were still enjoying life on the carriage, where they were being treated like nobles. Ultra held a mug of beer, laughing loudly. This life is great. There's nothing better than enjoying good food and drinking beer, he said, slapping Gordon, who was grimacing, on the back. Gordon frowned, looking around. This is strange. We used to be monster hunters, and now we're being treated like nobles. But I can't help but think about Mars. He could be in trouble. Ultra nodded. Yeah, but he's talented. I'm sure he can take care of himself. Despite this, a part of Ultra couldn't feel completely at ease, worried about his companion. Ilya was distracted by the speed of the carriage, while Tina admitted she felt sorry for Mars for missing out on such a carriage ride. Gordon argued there wasn't enough room for all of them, since the carriage could only hold a maximum of 4 people, which made Ultra laugh out loud. At the phenomenon of an undefeated S-rank dungeon boss reaching maturity, causing monsters to start pouring out of the dungeon. This could be prevented by conquering the dungeon before they could escape. Guilds were formed to prevent such situations, and during a traditional event called a debut show, adventurers would try to capture the attention of the nobility to earn rewards for their party or guild. In some cases, an adventurer who succeeded in this event was granted a title by the nobility. That was exactly what Ultra and his group were aiming for. The venue for the debut show was only a day's walk away, but Duke Beak had sent a carriage to pick them up, which clearly showed the Dukes high expectations for their group's outstanding abilities. Tina said it wouldn't matter if they took a little extra time on their journey. Ultra agreed and poured another drink into his glass. The carriage driver called out to the members of the Sword of Divine Silver, announcing that they would soon be leaving the city, and warning that the ride would get a little bumpier. Still, the driver tried to reassure them that the carriage, even on rough roads, wouldn't spill anyone's tea. While that might have been true, the driver hadn't expected to run into wild boars on the way out of the city. While Ultra was confidently trying to sip his drink, he was quickly humbled when he spilled it all over himself, right after declaring there was no need to worry. He cried out in frustration as the drink stained his clothes while Gordon put a hand over his face, possibly to hide his laughter or for some other reason. Ultra stuck his head out the window to yell at the driver for making a long-haired swordsman spill his drink on his new armor, to which the driver quickly apologized. But as soon as Ultra realized there were wild boars on the road, he was confused as to why they were on this main road. Ultra pulled himself back inside the carriage and tried to order Gordon to do something about the situation, but Gordon just kept a hand over his mouth, claiming he was a bit motion sick after the carriage had jolted so violently a moment ago. He turned to call for Aaliyah, who was sound asleep despite all the noise, and meanwhile Tina, the party's healer, was seemingly unable to fight. So Ultra decided to handle the problem himself and fight the boars as a warm-up before his trip to see Duke Beak. A pair of poisoned boars would normally be tough for an A rank to handle, but with only 2 of them, Ultra believed he could manage. He activated his Sword Saint skill, and one of the boars was instantly defeated. But Ultra quickly realized that he was moving faster than usual and was about to crash into a nearby tree. Ultra groaned in pain, clutching his body as he held his sword, wondering what had just happened. He was sure he had the Hawk's Eye skill and should have still been able to see his enemy while using Sword Saint. But now he couldn't see a thing. Ultra decided to blame his problem on drinking too much, and he took a deep breath, aiming his sword at the remaining wild boar, believing the crash had sobered him up and that he would now cut down the next one cleanly. He activated the Sword Saint skill once more. The wild boar was defeated as expected, but it wasn't as clean a kill as Ultra had wanted, and his sword got stuck in the ground, sending him flying several meters away, before he clutched his body in pain once again. The long-haired swordsman was even more confused, until he had a flashback of what Mars had told him about having to return everything they had borrowed. This realization made Ultra start hyperventilating and foaming at the mouth. With only 1 day left, Ultra would have to demonstrate his Sword Saint skill at the debut show. And in what seemed like the blink of an eye, the day of the debut show arrived. People gathered in the seats of a large arena, while Duke Beck stood proudly on the highest balcony. Another man stood beside the Duke, announcing that the Sword of Divine Silver party would now perform their debut. The four of them stood side by side, waiting for the man to continue. Gordon stood firm. Aaliyah looked confused and tired, while both Ultra and Tina were sweating with anxiety. Tina was the most expressive, knowing that something would likely go wrong during the performance. The announcer said that the party would be using the skills they used to clear the demon territory and asked them to demonstrate them for everyone in the audience. Ultra knew this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and he absolutely could not fail. Not in front of a nobleman. The long-haired swordsman was determined to successfully showcase his combat skills, make Duca Beck acknowledge his strength, and become a nobleman himself. The announcer spoke again, revealing that the nobles had dispatched an A-rank team to prepare the monsters Ultra had requested as his opponents. Meanwhile, that very same A-rank team was monitoring the performance and protecting the audience, just in case something happened. Ultra began to sweat and worry again, knowing that things wouldn't go smoothly. However, he tried to reassure himself that everything would be fine, as long as he could strike the enemy instantly, even without seeing them. The monsters that Ultra had requested the organizers to prepare were a species with hard shells that would continue to fight even after losing their heads. The frenzied warriors of the underground ant army. Even though the gate hadn't opened, Ultra knew there were about 50 monsters ready for battle. Gordon called out to Ultra, asking if he should say something to the nobles in the audience before they began. The long-haired swordsman took a deep breath before loudly declaring that they would crush the monsters with their swords and deliver a rain of blood that everyone could look forward to. This lack of professionalism made a few women turn away, covering their mouths to keep from laughing, while Duca Beak stood silently, waiting to see what would happen. Ultra said it was time to begin, and whispered to Gordon that he should stay quiet and stand guard, telling him to try and gather as many of the ants around himself as possible. Gordon was confused but agreed anyway. Now it was time for the debut to begin, as the cage door slowly opened and the swarm of ants began to pour out. Gordon slammed his shield into the ground, and he quickly activated his obsidian skill as the ant army rushed out from the wooden gate, gathering into a group and charging straight towards them. Without a moment's hesitation, Gordon seemed ready to face the monsters as all the ants crashed into his shield with great force, slowly starting to grind it down with their mandibles. Gordon grunted in frustration and exhaustion at the strength of the ant army, as they began to mass together and push hard against the shield, instead of just a few focusing on it. Ultra praised Gordon for the job he was doing, and the long-haired swordsman raised his sword, telling Gordon to keep holding the ants back. Ultra began to activate his Sword Saint skill, but as expected, he still couldn't control it without Hawk's-Eye. As a result, he crashed into a nearby wall of the arena with a cry, startling Gordon and the surrounding audience. An expression of displeasure appeared on Duca Beak's face, while a group of A-rank hunters stood on the sidelines with surprised looks. Gordon, confused, frowned and asked what Ultra was doing. Ultra started to get up as debris fell to the ground beside him, and he immediately glanced back at the Duke with a worried expression, then quickly jumped back and pretended like nothing had happened. Ultra told the Duke that he had just felt a little nervous and would proceed to win the battle with his next attack. However, Duca Beak remained silent throughout this exchange, his faith in the swordsman seemingly starting to wane. Ultra turned back to face the ant army and tried to activate the Sword Saint skill again but failed. He collapsed and skidded across the ground. He tried again to no avail and crashed down once more as the ants continued to crawl towards Gordon. The long-haired swordsman began to worry about how the performance was going, given the spectacle he'd made. Still, he tried to remain calm, though it was getting harder with each passing second. He tried to play it off as a joke, saying he was just kidding around, laughing nervously as debris fell onto his bruised and anxious face. Tina watched with a horrified expression, weakly calling out to Ultra, while Aaliyah remained silent, staring into the distance. The A-rank hunters wondered if Ultra really couldn't see the enemy. Another hunter said that was impossible because of Ultra's Hawk's Eye skill. However, more and more hunters began to murmur amongst themselves, recalling that the Hawk's Eye skill was one borrowed from Mars, and they wondered if it had been returned yet. It was said that the other members of the team had also borrowed skills from Mars. All the hunters wondered just how many skills Mars had actually lent to each member of the Sword of Divine Silver team. Ultra slowly got to his feet, while Gordon watched him worriedly. He realized that Ultra had lost his Hawk's Eye skill just by looking at his condition. That was why Ultra's eyes couldn't keep up with the speed of Sword Saint, and why he couldn't see where he was going before hitting the wall. At that moment, the A-rank hunters knew that, although it was hard to believe, the truth was that the Sword of Divine Silver team had been held up by its members borrowing a large number of skills from Mars. Gordon called for Tina to do something and heal Ultra with her Wings of the Angel skill, causing her to cry out in surprise and agree to do so. However, as she hesitantly raised her arm and tried to activate her skill, nothing happened. There was only silence. Gordon began to sweat as he saw everything falling apart before his very eyes. Tina tried to activate her skill again, and then again, but in the end, nothing worked. She started panting as she confirmed that the power of the angels had truly vanished. Tina collapsed to the ground and started crying, while Gordon tried to encourage her to pull herself together, while Ultra kept trying to use his skill, but still failed. Aaliyah knelt beside Ultra, trying to beg her to use ancient magic to strengthen him. However, she replied that it was impossible, and thought the next best thing would be to get her saliva on her finger, and then dab it on Ultra's face, claiming that his wounds would heal faster with her saliva. Suddenly, Ultra remembered the presence of Duke Abik, and he turned around, gasping, only to realize that the Duke, along with the other nobles, had left, leaving only a closed door behind. A horrified expression appeared on Ultra's face as he screamed in terror at the tightly shut door, while Gordon was being overwhelmed by the swarm of ants screaming for help. In the end, the A-rank hunters and Duke Abik's guards had to jump in to help the four of them, and just like that, the worst debut in history came to a close. A week had passed since the group's embarrassing and disastrous debut, and Ultra was seen sitting on a chair, saddened by what had happened to the four of them. Aaliyah was recounting the terrible situation, explaining that it had been days since they'd last seen Tina, and Gordon had locked himself in his room. Ultra wished that the meeting request he sent would be accepted, giving him a chance to make excuses and try to prove himself to the Duke. Ultra asked Aaliyah about the reply to the letter they sent, which the butler had promised to respond to. Aaliyah looked up at the moon and said it was coming soon. Suddenly, the wooden door opened, and just as Aaliyah had said, the butler had arrived with the response to the letter Ultra had sent. Ultra stood up from his chair as the butler pulled out and handed a scroll to the long-haired swordsman. He waited intently for the response, slowly taking the scroll while Aaliyah stood in the background. He clutched the scroll and tried to beg the butler for a face-to-face meeting with the Duke, believing that if they could just talk, everything would be fine. But the butler cut him off, shoving another paper in Ultra's face. It was the response the Duke had sent. The paper was a rejection. Ultra couldn't accept this reality. He threw the papers to the ground and declared that he just wasn't feeling well that day. The butler raised a hand with 3 fingers, telling Ultra to listen, as there seemed to be a misunderstanding. He explained that His Grace dislikes people who make excuses, despite having shown the group tolerance. 1 finger went down, counting down the chances Ultra had before everything went wrong. The first chance was that Ultra failed to report the trouble with his skill before the demonstration, which could have helped the nobles give the group a chance in the next 2 or 3 months. However, even though it was the responsible thing for Ultra to do, he was too proud to report it. It's human nature to always try before giving up, something the butler understood and knew the Duke would have still sympathized with Ultra for, even if he had failed his attack. Ultimately, when Ultra failed his first sword thrust and fell, that was proof that his power was waning. However, a second finger went down as the butler told Ultra that he kept trying even after his failure. Ultra was stunned for a moment, not knowing what that meant, but the butler asked him how many attacks he had attempted with his uncontrollable sword saint skill. Ultra couldn't answer out of shame. The butler explained that it wasn't impossible that, by chance, one of Ultra's attacks could have hit a lord or lady. The result would have been clear as to what would happen to the members of the Divine Silver Squad. Imprisonment, torture, hanging. Ultra collapsed to the ground, overwhelmed. While the butler was excusing himself, he told the swordsman that he was still young and needed to keep an open mind and cherish his life. Ultra still tried to beg the butler one more time for a chance to talk. But the only reply from the man in the suit was that, if a natural disaster or a citizen revolt occurred, that would be Ultra's only chance to try and get his lord's attention, as the Duke was the one who managed this land. The butler believed there would be another chance for them to meet, though the probability was very low. After that unfortunate day, the butler quickly departed, leaving the 2 of them, Ultra and Aaliyah, behind. And Aaliyah brought a hand to her chin, thinking about how she hadn't been completely rejected. Ultra began to slam his fists on the ground, leaving dents in the wooden floor, as he screamed in a rage, clutching his hair and yelling about how everything was ruined, all because of Mars. Aaliyah could no longer use magic. Tina had lost her healing powers and disappeared. And Gordon, although he still had his obsidian skill, had locked himself in his room after being traumatized by the ant swarm attack. Ultra's path to becoming a nobleman, along with his future, was gone. However, the long-haired swordsman only thought about that for a moment. He crushed a piece of wood in his hand and shouted with joy. He believed there was still one last chance to prove the strength of the Divine Silver Party, and that was the replacement member for when Ultra kicked Mars out, the genius alchemist, Angelina. She hadn't arrived yet, but Elia mentioned she'd received a report that Angelina was already in the city that day, making Ultra even more excited about this new opportunity. Ultra believed his future wasn't over, and that they would find a breakthrough sooner or later, thinking that was what the butler had hinted at when he spoke of keeping an open mind. Somewhere else in the city, a girl sat on a chair talking to a small creature made of rock in her hand. This was Angelina. The alchemist Ultra was so eager to meet. She told the small creature that she would go to the guild the next day, even though she was late. She eagerly wondered what kind of person this skill lender would be. The next day, Mars and Shizuku stood facing each other as the return process began. The time boost skill was about to be returned to the black-haired boy. Energy shone around the girl, before flowing back into Mars. Shizuku hung her head with a disappointed sigh, thinking this meant saying goodbye to the perfect power of the Armor of the Fanged Wolf skill. Mars reassured the little girl that it wasn't like she had lost the skill completely. She could have it lent to her again later if needed. But the little wolf girl felt terrible knowing she could usually only use the skill for about 10 seconds. Suddenly, Yue congratulated Shizuku because she could still use the time boost skill without it being lent to her. The girl was confused, until Mars explained that it had become her own true skill. This confused her even more, but Mars said he would explain why she had learned the time boost skill after they finished their next job. As they were leaving the room through the door, a large elderly man was suddenly standing right outside. It was the mayor. He leaned on his cane and asked Mars and the other two for a favor while they were still living in town. Yue and Shizuku were confused as Mars invited the mayor into the room to explain the job more clearly. Mars sat on the bed, waiting with anticipation for the old man's next words. The mayor got straight to the point and immediately asked Mars and the others to take on a monster extermination job, as it was a problem that couldn't be ignored. For the past few months, the monsters near Kinui had become increasingly active. Mars already knew this, as they had to fight about 80 of them on their way to town. He had tried to protect the town by hiring about 40 mercenaries, but they all fell ill before they could do their job. This made Mars and Shizuku exchange a shocked glance as they realized they were the ones who had defeated the mercenaries that one night. The mayor noticed the wolf girl's bewilderment and raised a hand to reassure her, telling Shizuku that while it was true Garen and the mercenaries were to blame for that incident, it was still true that the town needed to do something about the monsters. He needed someone who could replace those 40 mercenaries, and there was no one else but Mars and the others. Yue asked Mars what the plan was, and he hummed thoughtfully. He knew this was an unexpected job that had nothing to do with saving the hidden wolf village. Shizuku said the monster activity might be due to the dungeon, and that alone was enough for Mars to realize they couldn't let the situation get any worse and would handle it, at least until a replacement arrived. Mars stood up, telling the others they would be leaving immediately. They stepped out of the building and into the forest, where Mars activated his scout's insight and God's Eye abilities. He detected about 100 monsters roaming around, but this wasn't a problem for the dark-haired boy, as he quickly slashed through all of them in just a few seconds with his spatial magic. As they continued walking, Mars saw this as a good opportunity to continue their conversation. He explained that normally, people would need to study or practice hard to accumulate 1,000 skill points before learning a skill. But he did that for other people, before lending them the skill. If a person uses that skill more, it gets stronger and can even evolve. Mars said that, more accurately, he lends skill points, or SP, to people before lending them the skill for a period of 10 days or more. Although he could only lend one skill to one person at a time, there were times he could lend a range-boosting skill to one person that would affect the entire group. Shizuku was impressed and said he could lend out 1 million SP to create an army. But Mars explained the interest process, saying that paying back such a large amount of SP within 10 days would be impossible, and it would be dangerous not knowing what might happen. There were still many unexplained parts to this skill that Mars didn't want to approach recklessly, so he wouldn't lend her anything she couldn't handle. The wolf girl thought for a moment and did the math, realizing that using the skill had increased her SP enough that she would still have over 1,000 left after paying Mars back, which made her very excited. She tried to ask if Mars could lend her another skill. However, Yue suddenly appeared behind her. and explained that her way of thinking was like someone who was deep in debt and getting desperate. This frightened Shizuku. She said that she understood. Shizuku stood watching the others gather materials, her tail wagging happily. At the sight of the storage skill Mars was using, Mars noticed her reaction and asked what skill she wanted, to which she replied that she wanted the storage skill he had. However, Mars had to explain to her that it was a combination of 3 different skills working together. If there really was a normal skill that did what Mars was doing, it would be incredibly powerful and dangerous. He thought about what it would be like to carry all the materials he gathered on his back, and the thought was terrifying. Mars continued to explain how his storage skill worked, and Shizuku understood that the black-haired boy would create an ice cage using his Kusaida skill, before using his space jump skill, to send it flying upwards. The wolf girl thought you were talking about the sky, but Mars corrected her, saying there's an area called the Sea of Stars, which was explored by an adventurer in the past who never returned, only leaving behind records of the place. He's going to keep it in a place like that instead of anywhere else, because too many things happen on the surface and underground that could harm the items he wants to keep hidden. Someone taught Mars something in the past. Choose your skills based on their synergy, but Mars knew that wasn't something Ultra ever considered. He saw a sword-shaped tree branch stuck in the ground, and picked it up, thinking about how Ultra had probably realized the loss of support skills for his Sword Saint ability made the skill too overwhelming for the long-haired swordsman. The branch crumbled in Mars's hand. As he looked up at the bright sky, the wind blowing through his hair, before Yue informed him that a horde of monsters was approaching them. He turned to Shizuku and asked if she was ready, as she activated both of her skills and charged towards the monsters. 4 days later, when the replacement mercenaries arrived in Kanui, all the monsters around the town had been eliminated. After completing the monster extermination quest, Mars, Yue, and Shizuku decided to go to the mayor's house to report their success and handle another one of their tasks. Mars was feeling a bit mentally drained and politely asked Yue to handle the situation for him, and she had no objection to his decision. They entered the building and sat on one of the sofas inside, across from a woman with curly hair and glasses. The woman greeted them and asked how she could help them today. However, Mars asked her first who she was. She announced that she was the mayor's secretary. The secretary asked again about their business, and Mars firmly placed a large ice container on the floor, which had appeared out of thin air, filled with parts and materials from the monsters they had fought. He told her they were there to report the monster extermination, and were handing over proof of completion to the mayor. The secretary was startled by the sudden appearance of the container. But when she looked inside, she began to sweat in astonishment at the sheer amount of materials within. As if confirming her worried thoughts about that one ice container, Yue explained that she hoped the secretary could sell the materials separately from the reward they would receive for completing the quest. And for that reason, the group had brought it to the building along with 12 other ice containers outside in the garden, which shocked the secretary even more. The secretary wondered what she should do, because she knew that these materials could fetch a high price at the guild, and she roughly estimated that the materials in this container alone were worth over 10 million yen. Finally, she spoke up and said that it was impossible, which made Yue wonder if she meant she didn't want to accept the materials. However, the secretary quickly corrected herself, saying that her words didn't mean she was going to break their agreement. Rather, such a large amount of gold would completely drain the town's savings and tax funds. Yue looked towards the dark-haired boy who nodded at her, and indicated she could tell the secretary that they could lend them the materials for free, and sell them before paying Mars and the others. The secretary agreed to the terms, and with that the 3 of them left after receiving the mayor's approval. Mars stared at the document that proved the agreement between the mayor, the secretary, and him and his party. It explained that they would be paid in gold or reasonable cooperation within the next 10 years for their help in gathering so many materials from the extermination. The dark-haired boy told Yue that the deal was a good one and thanked her for her help. She reminded him to let her know if there was anything else she could do. Mars wondered why she said that, and asked if he was being too guarded or if his face was showing any negative emotions. But Yue replied that she didn't believe that was true. Even so, Mars knew he was a bit tense, as they had gotten themselves into an interesting situation. The 3 of them had thrown this town into chaos with their actions. The faraway Azure Dungeon is located near the surviving village, a refuge for the werewolves, which means the village might not be in good shape. He knew that materials would be needed to restore the village, and the chances of gathering some from Kanui were high, However, Mars realized that gathering too many materials to restore the village would make people suspicious. He wanted to build a fair relationship between humans and werewolves, as well as foster a good relationship with the residents of Kanui. Therefore, it was better not to hide anything from the start. Finally, the dark-haired young man spoke up after thinking it over, explaining that they could still gather materials through the mayor as a cover and keep the news from leaking to the public. He stood up and got the werewolf girl's attention, asking Shizuku if she agreed. This made her fall silent for a moment before saying she didn't mind. Shizuku told Mars that since he doesn't let others die or steal anyone's power, she believed his method was the only way that could work. Mars turned to Yue, who nodded at him. It was time for them to set off on the next step of their journey. If the demi-human race that lost the war was also the race that had their rights stripped away, then Mars would do whatever he could to help them, and so the three of them set off to clear the faraway Azure dungeon. Someone was struggling to keep their eyes open, calling out Shizuku's name and asking where the little werewolf girl was. The surroundings revealed a completely destroyed environment, with raging flames burning the village to the ground. This person's identity was unknown, but they called Shizuku their daughter and indirectly told her not to return to the village, as the faraway dungeon was controlled by the will of the enemy. They didn't want to die, feeling that they couldn't die just yet. This person knew they still hadn't told Shizuku the name of the devourer. Mars and the others were now walking through the forest, with Shizuku leading the way. She was the only one who knew the location of their den. Mars only knew about werewolves from stories and legends. He decided this was a good opportunity to ask the young girl about the history of the werewolves, and she shared what her mother and father had taught her long ago. The werewolves had been driven out by a war against humans, forcing them to hide in the forest. The men, the elderly, and the weak were all killed in battle, while those who fled were only women and children, along with others from the tribe who couldn't fight. The werewolves could only live on the land they chose, which was the mountains, as it was far from humans. Shizuku said that the remaining werewolves were her grandfather and a few other relatives. Mars began to understand things more clearly, that they were all owners of the special skill Armored Fang Wolf, and found more meaning in the land they lived on than even their own homeland. Shizuku continued her story, saying their strength began to wane as the forests gradually disappeared due to the greed of hunters who destroyed the surrounding nature for industrialization or simply abandoned the efforts that had been made. As the forest began to be destroyed, the werewolves fled, and eventually all settled in a valley that humans couldn't enter, even if they wanted to. The werewolves were able to live peacefully in the remainder of the forest. That was the history of the Hidden Wolf Village. As the three continued through the forest, Mars began to get used to the terrain, but he noticed the surrounding rocks starting to become brittle and the dry ground turning sandy. The weather had an extreme temperature difference compared to what was normally found in most parts of the world. The werewolves' habitat was a very harsh environment, something Mars gradually realized from the heavy breaths all three of them took during their journey to the den. He turned to ask Yue if she was okay, but she said there was no problem. And they continued to follow Shizuku through the forest as the temperature began to rise. Mars thought that no one could have imagined that demi-humans had been living in secret in a place like this for 3 generations, not to mention the existence of an S-rank dungeon. Shizuku added that the dungeon was a dangerous place, even though the werewolves continued to get meat and materials from it. They had entered the shallow depths of the faraway Azure, though not without losses, and did whatever they could to survive, even if it meant drinking monster blood. Shizuku stopped and looked into the distance, where the village was nearby, as the wind blew around them. But something seemed wrong. Something was off in the distance ahead. Mars noticed this and activated his God's Eyes skill to get a closer look at what was happening in the village. He told Shizuku that it looked like there was smoke, and it didn't seem like smoke from cooking or some careless mistake. However, even though Mars remained calm, Shizuku immediately became anxious, explaining that making smoke was forbidden in the village, and began to tremble, sweating with fear and anxiety, believing that something must have happened. Mars immediately grabbed both girls by the waist and shoulders, and activated his spatial jump skill, teleporting all 3 of them right above the village, which was engulfed in flames when they arrived. Shizuku watched in horror as the 3 of them wondered what was happening. Mars asked the wolf girl which house was hers, and she pointed to one not far away. She started reaching for her house, struggling in Mars's arms. However, he told her to stop, wanting to handle the situation quickly. Mars activated his skill, Asura's 6 arms, and while two arms continued to hold Shizuku and Yue, he landed on the ground. He punched through all the insect-like monsters swarming the village. Nothing could stand in Mars's way. As he slaughtered all the monsters on the path to Shizuku's house, Yue turned to ask Mars if he was hurt, but he shouted back that he was fine. They were almost there. Shizuku saw the monsters closing in on her house, which sent her into a rage. She burst out of Mars's arms, activating her Armor Fang Wolf skill. She screamed at the monsters, demanding they get away from her home, and then began tearing them apart. With her bare hands. Before rushing into the house with a look of panic, the wolf girl found her parents lying on the ground, unconscious and covered in burns. She screamed to Mars that they weren't breathing and were badly injured. Mars knew the house wasn't safe, and that they should carry her parents outside. Before he healed them with his Seraph's Blessing skill, just as he had used it to save Garen before, the burns on her parents' skin slowly began to fade. And now they were okay, though still unconscious from smoke inhalation. Shizuku took one of her parents' hands and held it to her face, whispering her thanks to Mars as tears of joy streamed down her cheeks at the thought that her parents were alive. Mars remained silent for a moment, looking around the village, still wondering what was going on. The strong hunt the weak to become stronger, while the weaker hunted and become weaker. That is the law of nature. However, to defy that nature, humans seek wisdom and build civilizations and cultures. But what unfolded before Mars's eyes were people who, having had everything taken from them, were not even allowed to fight back against this disaster from the dungeon. Their land, families, and dignity had been stolen, and now their very lives were on the line. In the end, nothing in society had changed, and these people could only suffer in silence. They built a society and chose a king. But if that's all humanity does, what place is there for the wolf people and the other races? Yu spoke up, interrupting Mars's train of thought, and asked if they should save the villagers first. But Mars replied that they needed to focus on defeating the boss, something deep within the dungeon to stop the flow of monsters in the area. He asked Shizuku if she could protect the villagers on her own. She hesitated slightly. Seeing this, Mars decided to give her another skill. The lending process is starting. Before she could react, Mars told her he was giving her the skill Scout's Intuition, so that she could detect danger. The wolf girl didn't understand why he would give her this skill when the enemy was right in front of them. But Mars explained that it was so she could run away. He wanted her to have a chance to escape safely if she felt overwhelmed and couldn't do anything, even if she had to leave on her own. Shizuku was offended by his suggestion, insisting that she would not run away, even if it cost her her life. Mars agreed with her sentiment, but he wanted her to live, because that is the natural instinct of a living being. The idea that simply surviving is a victory is the way of wild beasts. Humans are different. Mere existence is not enough to be called living. So, Mars's suggestion could be seen as selfish. Surprisingly, Shizuku understood that, but she insisted that she would never run. Mars told Shizuku that they would part ways here. He would go destroy the boss and stop the monsters from spawning in the village, while Shizuku would stay to protect the residents. He wanted to ask her to promise him something, but he knew she would hesitate. However, she understood what he wanted, and reassured him that she wouldn't throw her life away so easily. She held out her hand, and the two locked them in a promise. Shizuku was about to tell them where to go, but Mars said it wasn't necessary, as her priority was to protect the village. The two then set off on their separate missions, and it would be a long time before they met again. Shizuku continued to tear through every monster in her path, while Mars asked Yue about their spawn point. The little girl clung tightly to his back as he ran up a dirt path. Yue said that the spawn point was likely to the west of the mountain, and the entrance to faraway Azure might be there as well, based on the direction the monsters were moving. However, the journey there would not be peaceful, as monsters began to swarm from behind, drawing the attention of both. Mars flicked his chin, instantly destroying them with his hand skill, ordering them to get out of the way, as they were nothing but small fry in his mission. He leaped away with incredible speed and continued up the mountain path, noticing that it was easy to traverse and well-maintained, meaning this was likely the path the wolf people from the village used to get to the labyrinth. Yu lifted her head, looking towards the approaching building. Mars said that it was faraway Azure, with monsters pouring out of the entrance with no sign of stopping. Mars began to approach the dungeon, realizing that every second was precious. He told Yue he was counting on her, and she nodded in confirmation. His skill was activated through Yue, as she selected the obsidian skill from Gordon and took it, evolving it into adamantine barrier. This was a more powerful version of the previous skill. Gordon's strength points, SP, had now reached the minimum threshold, and the maximum SP would be automatically collected from him until the SP debt was paid. One of the insect-like monsters lunged towards Mars, but he immediately activated the adamantine barrier skill, blocking the attack and sending it flying. Mars finished it with a punch, causing the monster to explode. All attacks from the monsters were useless, as the adamantine barrier was heavier than lead and would repel any kind of attack, unshaken by even the most powerful blows. By combining its weight and hardness with a powerful charge, the shield could become a cannon. More and more monsters continued to fly or crawl towards him and Yue. While Mars activated the full power of his skill, Azura 6 arms, creating what was called the Great Ram, with just a single swift movement. Mars pierced through all the monsters effortlessly, annihilating them one by one, slicing through them as he flew into the dungeon's gate. He told Yue they would conquer this dungeon in a single run. She agreed without a hint of doubt. War is known as a contest for survival. Though one might offer various reasons, the true nature of war is a struggle to reproduce more, rather than just protecting one's living space. It's natural for the victor in battle to take, while the loser is taken from. On the first floor of the faraway Azure dungeon, Mars and Yue ran through the corridors together, wiping out any stray monsters. In Mars's mind, thoughts about why humans created culture and civilization were swirling. He thought it was because they wanted to distance themselves from war. He knew humans were special and unique, different from beasts because they had created civilization and redefined the laws of nature. That was what made humans human. But if that in turn led to war, under the pretext of the strong preying on the weak, then what was the reason for civilization's existence? The two of them descended the stairs. Mars stopped and signaled for Yue to stop as well. He said they would take a short break, to think about the next step in his plan, because the fourth floor of faraway Azure was nothing but a sea, with waves lapping against the sand. This seemed bizarre, but Mars realized that anything was possible in an S-rank dungeon. Yue watched the moving waves, tilting her head in curiosity before kneeling nearby. She cupped some water and was about to drink it. This act panicked Mars, and he called out to get her attention. However, there was nothing to worry about, as Yue explained that the water seemed to be fresh, cool, and non-toxic, with a quality like spring water. Mars sighed, looking at her with a weary expression as he accepted the new information. His heart had nearly leaped out of his chest. He advised her not to do things like that without thinking, because they didn't know what was in the dungeon's water. So Mars healed her first, just in case something bad was hidden in it. The two of them looked out at the vast expanse of water again, and Mars told Yue that dungeons always brought new and unexpected things. There were reports from adventurers who had seen landscapes in A-rank dungeons and skies in S-rank dungeons. Every dungeon was diverse and beyond human imagination. Mars guessed that faraway Azure was a dungeon of ocean and water. Yue asked if they should use a space jump to cross it, but Mars explained that it wasn't feasible as the body of water stretched as far as the eye could see. Furthermore, there were swarms of bees from above. And inside the water were numerous sea serpents. Water splashed everywhere as large, snake-like monsters emerged from the lake. Mars knew it would take a while if he had to jump multiple times while also avoiding the monsters. Yue asked him what they would do next, and Mars thought for a moment. Before deciding they should cross by boat, he used his Cositus skill to create a boat made of ice. They carefully stepped into the boat, and Mars activated an adamantine shield around it before setting off, as the serpents quickly rushed towards them. The next skill Mars activated was Song of the Divine Era to search for magic from the past and determine the direction they needed to row. Then he used other skills to cast the Stormwind spell, helping the boat speed across the water. The serpents and swarms of bees began to chase them again, causing Yue to worry and alert Mars to the situation. However, he wasn't worried at all, as he would use more skills and stack them on top of each other to create an even faster boat. The gust of wind behind them would slice through any monster that got close. Mars told Yue he would use the Great Ram skill, combined with the earth and water floors, to advance downward without delay. Meanwhile, at the hidden wolf village, Shizuku's parents slowly woke up from their unconscious state. Shizuku's father pulled the blanket off himself and sat up, looking at his body in confusion, wondering what was happening. Earlier, he recalled his home being attacked by the monster he had fought, until the house was consumed by fire, causing him and his wife to pass out from inhaling too much smoke. The Wolfman looked down at Shizuku's mother before looking at his own hands, confused as to how they had both survived and their wounds had been healed. Realizing the building they were in wasn't his home, he stood up and went outside to look around. He suddenly realized that his daughter was out there, fighting bravely against the monsters. Hearing her father's call, Shizuku turned around, overjoyed to see that he was awake. Her father asked how she was able to use the armor-fanged wolf skill for longer than 10 seconds. She replied that someone had lent her the power to use that skill in battle. Shizuku excitedly continued talking about that person and how they were on their way to stop the monsters in the dungeon. However, her father cut her off with an anxious cry, his expression dark, as he clenched his fists. He said that there was a very powerful enemy in the faraway Azure dungeon, but his daughter tried to reassure him there was no need to worry, since the person she knew could defeat hundreds of thousands of monsters. However, her father cut her off again, and explained that an enemy of their people was in there, the very one who had unleashed the monsters. Shizuku was confused, not knowing who her father was talking about, until he finally told her that their enemy was Duke Abik. Mars asked Yue how long it would take for them to reach the bottom floor, and she replied it would probably take about 30 minutes. This information didn't please Mars. On the contrary, he felt time in the dungeon was passing too slowly and that they needed to hurry, as they were approaching the dungeon's mini-boss room. Using the Asura's 6-arm skill, he and Yue leap through the air at high speed, but Mars noticed something up ahead and stopped to hide behind a rock. Yue was confused until he told her to be quiet, because there were other people in the dungeon. A group of 4 people with a familiar family crest on their shoulders. This symbol indicated that they belonged to the Adukul Abik family. However, Mars was confused because no one was supposed to know about this dungeon, let alone soldiers from the Adukul Abik family. Suddenly, one of the group members noticed Mars and Yue's presence, turned around, and called them out from their hiding spot. The 2 of them immediately stepped out without hesitation, leaving the other 4 very confused. The man who had called them out asked if they were guild members and demanded to know their names and affiliations. Mars answered honestly, saying he was a former member of the guild. The man recognized the name Mars, who was once part of the Sword of Divine Silver. Even though Mars had left the guild 3 weeks ago, the members of the group seemed unaware that he had left and burst into hysterical laughter, which made Mars realize that his old party's reputation had collapsed. They said that Ultra had disgraced himself in front of the Duke a few days ago, but Mars didn't care at all and wondered why they were telling him that. The swordsmen said their group had decided to conquer this dungeon on behalf of the Weekend Frail Guild, which had already left. Mars realized that his old party was here of their own accord, not under the Duke's orders, he thought to himself, but the swordsmen kept talking, warning Mars not to underestimate S-rank dungeons if he intended to restore his honor. This confirmed Mars's suspicion that the people in this group didn't know he had left the party long ago. Mars asked if they hadn't informed the Duke, and the answer was no, as the swordsman intended to defeat the dungeon before pretending that he was handling the monster attack. This meant the Duke still didn't know about the existence of the Hidden Wolf Village. Mars's plan was to capture these soldiers and steal their memories after conquering the dungeon. Yue clutched her necklace and felt that Shizuku was waiting for their return, and the 2 tried to continue on their journey. However, the swordsman told them to stop and tried to grab Yue threateningly. Mars pushed her out of the way just in time, keeping her safe, but the soldier ripped off her necklace and threw it into a nearby mud puddle. He tried to pretend his hand had slipped even though it was clearly a deliberate act, and said that Mars and Yue should hurry and find it before the pendant was lost forever. The soldiers quickly left, confident that they were superior to Mars. Once they were out of sight, Yue apologized and said she would find the necklace, while Mars insisted that wasn't necessary and that they could look for it together. He reminded her that the gemstone on the necklace was very important to the werewolves. Conquering the dungeon quickly wasn't their only goal, they also wanted to save the werewolves. Mars told Yue that they could look for the necklace, while the 4 soldiers would fight the general in the meantime, since the 2 of them should find the necklace before it sank deeper into the mud. Yue smiled and happily agreed. Just before the soldiers went through the door to the mini-boss, the swordsman laughed one last time, surprised to have met someone from the Divine Silver team. After searching for a while, they finally found the necklace, and Yue cheerfully thanked her master. Neither of them was covered in mud, as Mars had used a cleaning skill to remove it. He was happy to see the girl look so relieved after getting the necklace back. Now it was time to check on the 4 soldiers and see how they were doing. Mars raised his hand to use his inspection skill without having to go inside right away. He remembered the soldiers were very confident in their skills, which meant they must have defeated the general by now. However, all Mars could sense was a slug inside, completely unharmed. Despite how much time had passed, Yu tugged on Mars's cloak to get his attention and told him to look at the ground, where blood could be seen seeping out from under the door. This confirmed for Mars that the soldiers had not had a good time in there, and that meant they needed to handle the problem themselves. He opened the door and was immediately attacked, but he repelled it using his spatial rend skill, severing the approaching tentacles. Mars looked around and saw that 3 of the members were dead. He spotted the girl cowering in a dark corner of the room, trying to hide from the snail. She was curled up in a fetal position, her body trembling violently with fear, and she kept muttering that divine punishment had been brought down upon them. Mars asked the girl what she meant, but she was too terrified by his presence and could only beg for help. Mars replied that he would help her if she answered his questions truthfully. Mars's question was what the group had done, and the girl explained that the leader had lured the monster using a pungent-smelling potion. Mars understood that acting unilaterally was punishable in the army, and that he would need proof of just cause to avoid sanctions. This seemed to be what the swordsman was doing, but regardless of these soldiers' circumstances, the important thing in the main story was that the monster had been intentionally released. Mars put those thoughts aside to focus on getting to the boss as soon as possible, and told the 2 of them not to move from their spot. Mars approached the giant snail monster and used the skill Cositus to freeze it, but the monster wasn't affected much due to its high defense. Yue tried to tell him that he could attack it from the inside, but Mars's goal wasn't to defeat the general, but to conquer the dungeon as fast as possible. He called it lucky to run into this boss, leaving the 2 girls confused by his words. Right after that, Mars used his spatial leap skill to fly up into the air with the monster. He told them to close their eyes and cover their ears, before he sent the giant snail crashing down to the ground, leaving the girl bewildered. Yu explained that Mars was trying to create a hole to go straight down to the lower floors, and he succeeded, breaking through all the way to the 14th floor. Even though he'd easily reached the next floor with this new trick, Mars wasn't done yet. He continued to lift the snail and slam it into the ground again and again, destroying it repeatedly and bringing the group to the 15th floor, then continued to slam it down again. Mars slammed the giant snail all the way to the ceiling of the floor, where Yue and the girl were standing before pushing it down to the next floor, completely destroying it. The girl was astonished to discover that the dungeon floors could actually be broken. Mars confirmed this, saying that every adventurer has thought about digging straight from the first floor to the last at least once. However, no one had ever succeeded in destroying the floors, making everyone believe they were indestructible. The girl was still confused about how Mars could do this, especially since he was just a porter in the Divine Silver Party. But Yue, standing next to her, suddenly emitted a dark aura because of her words, causing the girl to quickly apologize. Yue calmed down and told the girl that Mars had left that party a long time ago. Although it's normal to listen to rumors, it's always best to verify the truth for yourself. Eventually, Mars broke through to the 20th floor, but he still didn't stop. He kept smashing and smashing until the only thing that broke was the snail. Mars was surprised and almost impressed to see the snail shatter, but that was a good sign, as it meant the floor they were on was special and couldn't be destroyed. Considering the number of floors Mars had destroyed, it was likely the next floor would be the final one. The girl realized that it had become quiet all around them, and Yue wondered if Mars had gone so deep that they could no longer hear any sound. But soon after, Mars, with his black hair, flew back up to take the 2 girls down to the next floor. Mars told them that he had finally reached the bottom of the S-rank dungeon, and it was now time for them to defeat the boss and conquer it. However, the girl from the soldiers' party fell to the ground, catching Mars and Yue's attention and confusing them. Mars asked what was wrong, while Yue offered a hand for the girl to take, but she refused to move, starting to tremble in fear. She repeated that humans can't run on water or fly in the sky, and that destroying a dungeon floor or defeating an S-rank dungeon was also impossible for a human. Yu asked for the girl's name, and she introduced herself as Marrow Brand. Yu quickly corrected Marrow, saying that humans can, in fact, run on water if they place their left foot forward before their right foot sinks. This response confused Marrow, who said that was nearly impossible. Yue replied that it was true, but not completely impossible. Nearly impossible and truly impossible are 2 different things, and right now, what Mars had achieved was the nearly impossible. Mars told Yue it was time for them to go, and the 2 of them left the girl sitting there as they jumped down to the deepest floor of the dungeon. They brought a broken piece of the giant snail with them, and landed without any problems, then moved forward to face a giant frog sitting on a pyramid-like platform. The monster croaked angrily upon seeing their presence. Mars noticed the frog couldn't completely hide its agitation, and asked the monster if it wasn't expecting an enemy from above. After all, adventurers would normally enter through a door at the end of a staircase between floors. Regardless, Mars proceeded to freeze the piece of the giant snail and told the frog he didn't have time to play with it, because a friend was waiting for him to return while she fought to protect her village. The frog tried to whip its tongue towards Mars and Yue, but the black-haired boy was faster and launched a shard of ice at the boss, killing it instantly as the shard pierced through the frog's head. And so, the battle ended in just a few seconds. At the village of the hidden werewolves, Shizuku was still trying to fight off all the monsters in the village, but she was starting to feel exhausted, panting heavily as bruises appeared on her small body. She looked up with her mouth agape when she saw a large, mantis-like monster standing before her, towering over her as the entire village continued to burn. The wolf girl looked down at her claws, believing she needed to push herself harder to protect her home. Shizuku drew more power from her wolf armor skill, but even with the time boost from her skill, she could feel the land telling her she had reached the limit of the mana she could borrow. Even so, she felt she had to reclaim the home her ancestors had protected. For that reason, Shizuku was determined to destroy everything trying to take away the place she held dear, and wanted to pave a path for her bloodline to survive. She roared that people shouldn't so easily say it's okay to run away. Shizuku recalled thinking the same thing when she heard the weak-willed words from the people in Kanui Town. She wanted those thoughts in her head to fall silent. And in a fit of rage, she charged toward the mantis, saying that a person can't call themselves human just because they're still breathing. Mars knew this, but still advised Shizuku to run and save herself. She saw him as someone stronger than anyone she had ever known, so she was certain he would conquer faraway Azure, which gave her the motivation and determination to protect the place she called home. Shizuku was nearly exhausted, but she would hold on until Mars returned. She ran up the side of a nearby building before leaping down, dodging the mantis's swing, and sliced off the large monster's head with her claws. The wolf girl then fell to the ground, and she slowly got back up, her body trembling violently from exhaustion. She congratulated herself on finishing the long battle. This mantis, she believed, was similar to the dungeon's commander, but her joy was cut short by her scout's intuition skill, which warned her of more monsters approaching the village. There were too many mantises for her. To keep fighting, she had reached her limit. Her father noticed this and told her to fall back, that she had done enough. But Shizuku sensed a great power that wasn't from an enemy and told her father not to worry. In the end, she was right. With the skill Great Ram, Mars, Yue, and the girl they had found in the dungeon charged through all the mantises and landed near where Shizuku was standing. The wolf girl looked up in amazement as she saw Mars's large figure emerge as the dust settled. The black-haired guy said he would handle things from here. But Shizuku was confused and immediately asked about the dungeon, to which Mars replied that he had conquered it the way he saw it with his God's Eye skill. The only monsters left were the ones in the village and around the nearby valley, but Mars didn't intend to let a single one escape. He asked Shizuku if all the residents of the Hidden Wolf village were in the back and away from the battle, and she immediately confirmed it. Since her father had confirmed this earlier, there would be no problem with Mars wiping out the rest of the monsters. Mars told Shizuku he was glad she made things simple, and told everyone around him to get down. He raised his hand and activated his storm wind technique, Aeoles. A vortex appeared in the air, swirling around the black-haired boy, as all the monsters began to be pulled towards the powerful whirlwind with no way to escape. Thousands of monsters shrieked and screamed in confusion and fear as they were flung upwards at high speed. Shizuku watched in amazement as everything flew whistling into the sky. Mars would soon use and combine both spatial rupture and cositis to create a blade of ice that sliced through every single monster in the blink of an eye. All that remained in the sky were tiny, glittering shards of ice. And everyone in the village, including Yue and Shizuku, watched with astonished expressions. At that moment, the frozen remains of all the monsters reflecting the sunlight rained down upon the mountains like a sign that this disaster was over. After a long and arduous battle extinguishing the flames of the Hidden Wolf village, Mars and Yue sat down on cushions, while the rest of the village sat before them, bowing their heads in respect and gratitude. Shizuku's parents thanked Mars and Yue for saving their daughter in the village, while introducing themselves as Asagi, the village chief, and Kasumi. Asagi expressed his regret, stating that they couldn't prepare any gifts, but he wanted to do his utmost for Mars and Yue. Mars responded by thanking the wolf people for their hospitality during such a difficult time. Suddenly, Shizuku's father said that if Mars wanted a concubine, he could have Shizuku. This left both Shizuku and Mars flustered and alarmed. The black-haired boy said that was perhaps a bit too much. And Asagi understood, seeing that Shizuku did not seem to agree. Mars tried to say that Shizuku was the young lady of the wolf tribe, but Asagi replied that he had royal blood in him, but his qualities as a king made it impossible for him to call Shizuku a princess. Hearing this, Mars asked more about the story related to the village's reconstruction, and Shizuku's father explained that the wolf tribe once had a king. However, a void remained, as a symbol had been lost in the flames of war. Although this tradition might end that day, Mars was still confused and asked Asagi what Sagi meant. The wolfman pointed to the necklaces that both Mars and Yue were wearing, explaining that these jewels were the very symbol that had returned to their people. It is called the Queen's Jewel, but the meaning of these necklaces is to designate the three who will sit on the throne: the king, his lady, and the heir. These three would each hold a jewel and pass it down through the generations. Asagi and Kasumi had worried that the jewels were lost somewhere in the valley, but thankfully they were in a safe place. The wolfman then picked up a sword he had kept by his side the entire time, which caught Mars' attention. Asagi began to draw the sword, saying that it too must be held by the one who sits on the throne and is called a katana. A dwarven blacksmith once lived with them on this land, and the sword was forged by that very blacksmith's ancestor. Mars observed the sword carefully. He noticed its slight curve and could easily tell that it was not forged by any human. The jewels and the sword in Mars' hands would prove his right to become king of the forest. But upon hearing this, Mars intended to give his jewel to Asagi, while Yue also intended to give her jewel to Kasumi. Asagi raised his hand to signal them to stop and explained that Shizuku had told them that Mars was traveling without a destination. If they were looking for a place to settle down, Mars could become their king. Asagi's family, along with the other wolf people, all stared intently at Mars and Yue. They awaited a reaction from the black-haired boy. After a moment of silence, Mars finally spoke. He told Asagi that his thinking might not be clear, as he had just nearly lost his family. Furthermore, Mars hadn't even been in the village for a full day. He said that the answer was no. But Asagi still tried to persuade Mars by asking if he knew about the laws of the wolf tribe. That each person should use their strength not for themselves but for others. Mars already knew this because it was what he had heard from Shizuku. Asagi explained that even though Mars possessed great power, he still used it for the benefit of the werewolves, and even returned the gems without any hesitation. A werewolf raised his hand as a signal, and all the beastmen in the room immediately bowed their heads, leaving Mars and Yue surprised by their actions. Asagi continued to explain that the werewolves bow to the strong and, above all, the proud, regardless of race or age. This showed their true desire to have the strongest person as the king of this land. Mars began to realize that he had misunderstood the werewolves, learning that their law was to choose the most outstanding warrior as their king. Asagi pleaded with Mars to accept the sword and allow them to hunt, farm, and fight for him, while the black-haired young man would end his journey in their village. Mars understood that his journey had no destination, and that there was nothing wrong with accepting the offer. However, just as Mars was about to reach for the sword, Yue stopped him from accepting it, and reminded him that she wanted him to choose a path he could truly accept. Mars decided to refuse the offer, and said that he had something he wanted to ask the werewolves. He went out to the courtyard where everyone was gathered around a cage, and inside it was Mero. He explained to everyone that she was the one who had been hiding in the dungeon, and was part of the group that released the monsters from it for their own personal greed. Mero confirmed this, causing the surrounding werewolves to look at each other in shock and anger. They began to argue about how to punish her, each offering different suggestions. For them, every action has its consequences, until they agreed that the punishment for Mero was death, to avenge the pain and anger over what had happened to their village and their people. One of them approached the cage, carrying the body of a dead child, and asked why the woman was still alive when the child was not, then begged her to return the child to them. Mero looked down in sadness and shame, about to say that she couldn't do it. But her words were interrupted by a voice calling out to her, asking what she would do if she could do something. She was surprised by the presence of that voice and wondered where it came from, until Mars explained that he could speak to her using sound waves from his voice, using his space jump skill so that no one but her could hear. Ignoring that, Mars immediately returned to the topic, and asked if she wanted to revive the child after he lent her his recovery skill, a Seraph's Blessing. But it would come at the cost of two things, her skills and her lifespan. No one knew for sure how much of her life would be lost, whether it would be years or decades. Although Tina could use it safely when combined with other skills, she never dared to use it even once. Mars asked Marrow again if she would accept the offer and do something instead of just repenting for her sins, even though it might lead to her death. Finally, Marrow agreed after hearing that. Mars nodded and told all the werewolves to listen to his idea. Before long, Miro used the borrowed skill to revive the child. The little girl gasped for air and asked if anyone else had passed away, but the child had been the only one. Even so, everyone was still unsure about what to do with Marrow. Even though she had healed the damage she caused, that didn't erase her crimes, and her punishment had yet to be decided. Suddenly, Shizuku stepped in and said that no one had listened to Marrow's side of the story. One of the werewolves tried to explain that it was hard for them to accept her word after everything she'd done. But Shizuku insisted that it was Marrow's place to speak, as it wasn't fair to make a decision without letting her say anything. The demi-humans stood around the cage, while the girl knelt, begging them to let her use her recovery skills to heal and revive her comrades, the ones who had fought alongside her for 6 years. Even though they had done the unforgivable, Mars couldn't help but remember his own past and the people he had fought with. The girl went on to explain that she would persuade her comrades and devote her strength, while also trying to negotiate with the Duke. Shizuku stared into her eyes, asking if she was prepared to do this, even if it cost her her life. Marrow confirmed without hesitation. To deny someone the chance to save those who can be saved is the same as killing them. Shizuku was satisfied with what she heard from the girl. She turned back and asked everyone if they were satisfied. Even if they punished Marrow severely, it wouldn't change anything, so they would keep the girl and her comrades to take on the task of gathering resources from the faraway Azura dungeon, before they were one day allowed to return to negotiate with the Hidden Wolf village. Mars watched as everything unfolded until he was once again invited to receive the sword. After a moment of thought, he accepted the offer, and Mars declared that he would become the king of the dispossessed and take back what was stolen to create a new future. All the werewolves bowed before Mars once more and agreed to follow him on that path. The next day, Marrow left the village ready for a new journey, until Yue noticed and asked where she was going. It seemed Yue had opened the gate for her, and Marrow was trying to leave before anyone found out. However, Yue reminded her that her escape attempt was expected, thanks to the werewolf's keen sense of smell and hearing. Knowing that no one was stopping her from escaping, Yue gave her a gift, a piece of ritra that Marrow could use to craft medicine, which would help restore the lifespan she had lost, as long as she went to a town of scholars in the far west. Marrow was confused. She didn't understand why she would receive such a precious item. However, Yue had a message for her from Mars, saying that the divine silver sword was actually just a third-rate item. Hearing this, Marrow began her journey. She left a message with Yue, saying she would thank Mars the next time they met. Meanwhile, Mars, Yue, and Shizuku continued on their journey. But immediately, they ran into a large stone golem, with a jewel in the middle of its chest. Yuki wondered about the golem, and Mars explained that it was an earth doll created by an alchemist. They're brought to life by the power of the earth, and their size depends on the skill of their creator. Shizuku worriedly asked what they should do. Mars told the wolf girl to return to the village and lead everyone to safety. He was determined not to let this golem get any further. Just then, a woman appeared and asked if he was the skill lender. She introduced herself as Angelina, the alchemist, and said that she had been looking for him. 2 months before meeting Mars, Angelina had visited the guild hall, where she was warmly welcomed by Ultra and Aaliyah. They threw a party to celebrate her arrival in the Sword of Divine Silver. Angelina thanked them reluctantly, but was also confused to see only the two of them, and wondered about the skill lender. While stuffing his face with food, Aaliyah asked Angelina about alchemy, which piqued the girl's interest, and she began to talk about it non-stop. Alchemy is the magic that makes the impossible possible, but that's only the case after alchemists go through repeated failures. Even so, this was what made alchemy so interesting to Angelina, as she dreamed of finding something that she couldn't do. Both Ultra and Aliyah agreed that dreams are important, and as Ultra was about to speak about the party's terms, Angelina immediately turned away, as she was no longer interested. The long-haired swordsman was confused and tried to stop her, but his actions only made Angelina even more flustered. Ultra was about to ask why the alchemist was preparing to leave, but was cut short when he looked down and noticed something. Angelina turned her back, looking embarrassed and annoyed, while Ultra tried to justify himself, saying he only looked down because of their height difference. She got back on topic and explained that she was here on business with Mars, the skill lender. However, Ultra tried to argue that someone like that wasn't necessary, insisting that he alone was enough for the party. Angelina let out a deep sigh, saying she wasn't interested in that, and asked if the swordsman understood the value of a skill lender. She said that if she combined her power with Mars, their synergy would become incredibly powerful, allowing them to do almost anything. Angelina had come a long way to find something that neither of them could do alone. Ultra still tried to convince her to stay, but the girl knew it was pointless to join a party that hadn't been active for a long time. Angelina thought about Ultra's words for a second and came up with an idea. She said that everything would be decided by playing a game. The two of them stepped out of the guild hall and townspeople began to gather around them in anticipation, wanting to see what would happen. The alchemist girl explained that it would be a one-on-one match between them. And a stubborn Ultra agreed, even though he knew deep down that things probably wouldn't go well. However, he felt like he had no other choice. Other than accepting the duel, the girl knelt on the ground. And he believed it was time to start the match. She placed her hands flat on the ground and quickly activated her Earth Golem skill. After Angelina placed her hands on the ground and activated her skill, small debris flew everywhere, causing dirt and sand to obscure Ultra's vision. From behind the cloud, two glowing eyes pierced through the dust with a terrifying aura, then seemed to rise and grow tall from the ground, causing Ultra to lean back in shock and fear. However, that expression quickly turned to confusion, as he stared at the unexpected situation before him. The girl stood up straight as the dust cleared, revealing a tiny golem less than 1 foot tall. While the long-haired knight stared in disappointment, Angelina looked down at the golem and called it adorable, saying that if it could be reborn as a human, it would one day be her husband. Ultra raised an eyebrow, looked at the golem, and asked if this tiny thing was all he had to fight. But this question offended Angelina, who said that the golem was her future husband. She explained that although it was temporary, the golem was alive, and she believed it would be reborn as a human one day so they could get married. Ultra thought that perhaps golems would swarm the area, but felt confident that the match would be easy against this tiny golem. But Angelina just smiled and waited for Aaliyah to give the signal. The sorceress, who was chewing on some food, raised the meat skewer and brought it down like a flag, signaling the start of the match. Ultra immediately rushed forward with a determined smile, believing the golem would move slowly due to its nature. But Angelina told him he should know better than to rely on conventional thinking. She activated the jump skill for the golem, causing it to suddenly disappear before Ultra's eyes, making him stop and look around in confusion. When the girl pointed to the sky, Ultra looked up, his face stunned as he witnessed the golem hurtling down from above. He had to hastily jump aside as the small golem crashed into the ground with great force. The long-haired knight stood there in shock, his mouth agape, while the sorceress girl explained that golems have a special trait. They can mirror the skills of their creator. Ultra looked at her in disbelief that a golem could use skills. Angelina told Ultra they would continue and activated the jump skill again. This time, Ultra seemed to have regained his confidence, and he stood up straight, saying that things would be easier now that he knew the golem's trick. He prepared to activate his holy sword skill, when suddenly, he was caught by something that shot up from the ground, holding his leg tight. He was confused as Angelina began to count down. Just as he realized what was happening, small golems crashed hard into his back. Angelina stood over him with a sickeningly sweet smile, asking if he wanted to surrender. But he was too stubborn, replying that he wouldn't surrender to someone in love with a golem. These words only angered the girl. She reactivated her Earth Golem skill and summoned more golems surrounding the area. She explained to Ultra that she could make anything emerge from the ground with her golems, while also passing her skills on to each one. She laughed maliciously and asked if it wasn't tragic for him to be defeated by a normal girl, unloved by humans. Ultra tried to say that he never called her that. Angelina immediately responded by activating the jump skill for the golems, continuing her attack on Ultra. When she finally won, Ultra lay under the weight of the golems, his body twitching. While Angelina walked over to Aaliyah and began to complain about how hard it was for her to find a husband. Aaliyah tried to reassure Angelina that she would meet someone someday. Suddenly, Angelina remembered something she wanted to ask Elia. The next morning, Ultra woke up with a scream. Elia greeted him calmly and complained that carrying him to the inn was hard work, and that she even needed help from the villagers. The long-haired knight asked where Angelina had gone, only to hear that she had already left the city, causing Ultra to grab his hair in frustration that their chance for a promotion had been ruined. He looked towards the corner of the room and noticed that Mars's luggage, which they had asked Gordon to retrieve from the Devil's Abyss, was gone. Ultra asked her where she had gone, and Elia casually replied that Angelina had asked for it, and she'd given it without hesitation, since they were friends who ate from the same plate. Ultra wondered why Angelina would want something like Mars's equipment, but Elia explained that Angelina had said she could find Mars using her scent-specialized golems. He was surprised to hear this information, and told Elia to get ready to head up to the bell tower, as they were going to look for Angelina. They went up to the top of the tower and looked down at the city, scanning for the alchemist girl. Elia got Ultra's attention. When she said that she'd found Angelina, who was already on her way, following Mars's scent, making Ultra smile brightly. Meanwhile, Mars was talking to the wolf people and explaining an item called the Vritra egg, which was located in the deepest part of faraway Azure. He said that it helps maintain the dungeon's stability. Everyone was shocked and confused when Mars mentioned Vritra, a serpent dragon capable of preserving a dragon with just its egg. Even after the egg hatched and grew, it would still keep the dungeon restored. Mars knew that this was one of the goals of his journey, to find a safe and secure place to nurture the egg. It was fortunate that he found this village with the dungeon nearby, and he believed the village would grow along with the serpent dragon in faraway Azure, with the first step already taken in that direction. The black-haired boy also said that the scale of the dungeon depends on the strength of the dungeon boss. For example, with the previous dungeon boss, the dungeon's limit was only 52 floors, but with Vritra now, Mars believed it could grow even further. However, that also meant Vritra wouldn't be able to coexist with humans and other creatures, like the werewolves. Mars said he would take full responsibility and reconquer the dungeon to prioritize everyone's safety. He turned to the group of soldiers they had captured earlier and asked one of them, Berman, about the thing he had asked them to find. The soldiers said they had found it. Shizuku's father looked into the flask and saw only water inside. He realized that the water quality seemed similar to the village's water supply. Mars explained that he had asked them to find water from the first floor of the dungeon, as the quality there was better than the lake on the fourth floor he had seen. And luckily, the soldiers had found water not far from the entrance. Shizuku's father was confused and asked Mars why he had them collect water when the werewolves already had water to grow wheat. Mars cut him off and asked if he knew why the wheat kept dying. The man thought for a moment and realized it was probably because the necessary minerals in the soil for growing wheat had been depleted. Moreover, even if they found a way to grow a different crop, the soil's fertility would only last for a few years. He also remembered that the village had its limits, which meant they couldn't prepare any new land for cultivation. Mars told them that the soil's fertility was worsening because they kept planting the same crop on the same land, leading to a phenomenon called repeated cultivation damage. Mars was curious about this damage and remembered hearing about a crop that could be grown for hundreds of years even on a small plot of land. And that was the rice plant. This crop is grown by sowing rice seeds in water-filled fields, as the water helps restore the soil's fertility and keeps it in a balanced state. With this information, Shizuku's father understood the situation and knew they would need a lot of water for this. Mars explained that rice is usually grown in lands with heavy rainfall and abundant water sources, but the village had no other water source besides the dungeon. That's why they needed to protect the dungeon to solve their water problem. Shizuku's father was amazed that Mars had thought of everything, and asked if he had any rice seeds. Mars said that he didn't have any, and approached the wolf girl, informing Shizuku that he was giving her the first task he had in mind. The wolf girl returned to Kanui, where Garen was sitting in his office, and thinking that his time wasn't up yet. A man entered and informed Garen that there was a client. Garen was confused until Shizuku walked into the building, causing him to nearly fall out of his chair in fear and beg her not to kill him. Shizuku felt insulted and said she wasn't a monster. Before sitting down on a nearby sofa, Garen was surprised as he thought she had already left Kanui, but Shizuku explained that she had just stepped out for a bit and came back because there were things she needed him to arrange. Garen wondered why she would ask such a thing, but she simply said that it was what Mars had told her to do, because Mars said that Garen would never refuse, even if his arm was cut off. Garen even insisted that he wouldn't refuse, especially not now, and asked who in their right mind would do so unnecessarily. Shizuku replied that was exactly why he would be a reliable and ideal supplier for the job. Garen just got angry and called her disrespectful, asking why she thought he would help Mars and the others. But Shizuku asked if Garen had forgotten. She turned to the other man, Eldora, and demanded he repeat what he had said when he attacked Mars. Eldora mumbled that he had told Mars, "I'll take everything you have." At that, Shizuku said, "In that case, I'll take everything you have too." Eldora replied, "Go ahead and try if you think you can." Garen was nearly driven mad with rage hearing all this. But Shizuku said he couldn't complain, since he was there too and didn't object to her choice of words, despite all that had been said during the battle. Mars still won, and Shizuku explained that they could just take everything they had and leave. But they had decided to spare Garen, wanting only to collect what was owed when they could. Garen was silent for a moment before grabbing Eldora by the collar and screaming at him about what he had done. Shizuku jumped in and told them that as long as they cooperated and handed over a portion of the trade profits, Mars would continue to do business with them. She threatened that she would return if they did anything wrong, but Garen cut her off, asking for confirmation that this was just another investment. He was still a bit skeptical, but very interested in how he would profit from this situation. The werewolf girl presented a piece of paper which Garen snatched. On it was a list of things he had to arrange and deliver to the mayor. This made Garen realize that he truly couldn't fight them, since the mayor was under their control. Garen collapsed to the floor in defeat, crying about his business. Shizuku said she had one more job for him, and she pulled out a stone, which he recognized as divine silver ore. The werewolf girl explained that he could trade this ore with Renono for money. Garen began to imagine the money he would make from all this, getting distracted before Shizuku asked him again if he agreed to the deal. And in the end, he immediately agreed. Shizuku returned to Mars's side and told him that everything had gone very smoothly. Mars was happy to hear it, because thanks to everyone's contributions, they would be able to maximize their profits. The werewolf girl felt conflicted, wondering if they should really let Garen profit as well. But Mars said it was better to make use of an enemy rather than just kill them. Mars said that now all that was left was to wait for the results. He looked down at the land where they had dug a ditch from the faraway azure and turned the dead fields into rice paddies, while also paving the mountain roads to bring fertilizer and wood from the forest. Gradually, the village's atmosphere was changing. Shizuku was happy to see everyone working so hard, and promised to do her best to complete her part. After 2.5 months, they encountered a giant earth golem over 40 meters tall. They met the alchemist, Angelina, who had followed them to the village, and introduced herself, saying she had been looking forward to meeting Mars. Angelina jumped down from the golem, and as Mars introduced himself, she explained that she came here after hearing information from Ultra. Mars was startled to hear Ultra's name, and asked if she had come looking for him on Ultra's orders, but Angelina quickly corrected him, saying she came because of her academic interest in him. Mars remembered that Ultra had said she would take on an alchemist to replace her, and wondered if this was the girl. He decided to believe she meant no harm, especially since she introduced herself openly instead of hiding. Even if she had hidden herself to prepare an attack, he would have felt at ease. The golem couldn't do much without the alchemist's guidance. Angelina was impressed with Mars's knowledge and continued to follow him into the village, where some werewolves run to report about the stone golem in the village. However, the old man wasn't worried, saying he had already discussed this matter with Mars. Asagi asked about the situation in the village and the fields, and learned that everything was going smoothly. He reminded the two werewolves not to let the river flow out of control and to find a way to harvest the tree trunks. He also told them to go to the village because Shizuku was gathering everyone there. Shizuku's father mumbled under his breath, feeling like the work was piling up, but there weren't enough people to do it. However, his thoughts were cut short when Mars approached and explained that he would make sure no one went hungry with the food he got from Kanui. In the not-so-distant future, everyone's hard work would be rewarded. Mars told Angelina that he didn't have time for her academic interests right now, but he couldn't let her leave because of her knowledge of the village's existence. She said that was fine, because she had come up with a proposal for an exchange, explaining that she saw the rice fields and would solve the labor force problem with her golems. In return, she wanted to be provided with lodging and a workshop. Angelina also tried to ask about the request, that she be allowed to live with Mars, but he just smiled and said he would agree to everything except for that last part, which made the alchemist girl laugh. Angelina was pleased that most of her requests were accepted, and she was happy that her workshop would be upgraded. Believing she could freely research golems and Mars's skill, Mars wondered how much the girl knew about his skill, and took the time to explain how skill lending worked, telling her that if she couldn't repay the debt, she would lose her skill. She tilted her head and said, nonchalantly, that she didn't mind giving up her earth skill, the golem skill, since in the end, she was the only one who could best control her golems. The black-haired boy chuckled, saying that the exchange agreement between them was complete, as long as she didn't leave the village area and provided assistance when needed. The next day, the golems began to become the main labor source for the village, although this seemed a bit strange to the werewolf villagers. Asagi was impressed with the golem's strength and how they could easily dig water channels. Mars asked the girl if she could retain the water they were losing and deal with the water that seeped into the ground or evaporated. While everyone else was cheerful, Mars wandered off, wanting to make sure Angelina wasn't being followed. But Angelina reassured him that she had already thought about that, because she heard from Elia that Ultra was looking for Mars. So she had extended her journey to 2 months. The reason was to ensure that she wasn't being followed, or even if she was, they would have already lost her trail, especially since she had used a golem to cross paths that were too steep for her own feet. Unfortunately, regardless of whether she was being followed or not, Ultra had found the village and was looking down from a cliff overlooking the werewolf village, a cunning smile on his face as he hoped that Angelina was there. 3 weeks ago at Duke Beek's mansion, Ultra was speaking with the butler, trying to claim that he was there on official business. Knowing he wouldn't be turned away since he still had the privileges of an S rank, Ultra recalled the head butler's conditions and called a witness, who was the mayor of Kanui, who was in chains. The butler asked the knight to keep things civil and asked the old man for his name and position. Vincent hesitantly introduced himself, stating he had been the mayor of Kanui for 10 years and explained that a werewolf used to live there but had left with some travelers. However, she had suddenly reappeared and purchased a large quantity of goods. The old man clenched his fists and felt guilty for mentioning Mars's name, not knowing he was being overheard, and wondered what would have happened otherwise. The butler already knew that. The goods purchased were food, building materials, grain, and farming equipment. But recently there were also weapons. Ultra tried to claim that all of this pointed to a werewolf uprising. With a huff, the butler stated that this Vincent had recently caught his attention, because there was a case involving his name regarding a group of soldiers from Duke Beek's elite unit, who were killed in the line of duty after an incident with Ultra's team. Vincent tried to say that he wasn't lying, as it was what he heard from someone in town. But the butler demanded the person's name, leaving the man feeling defeated and reluctantly admitting it was Mars. With this information, Ultra tried to spin the narrative, claiming that Mars had actually betrayed them, had kidnapped a werewolf, was the one behind the purchase of the goods, and was now planning the rebellion. The long-haired knight told the butler not to worry, as Mars was just small fry and would be easily captured with the Duke's power, which led the butler to accept this and grant Ultra an audience with the Duke directly. Ultra smiled and laughed inwardly, feeling confident and believing he would take back everything Mars had taken from him. Problems were expected when planting the rice fields, as not everything was perfect. Mars, along with the others and the rest of the werewolf village, looked on in disappointment as a werewolf informed the dark-haired boy that another rice paddy had been ruined, which meant this wasn't the first time it had happened. They had even divided the rice paddies into 7 sections, just in case this happened again, trying to prevent a total loss. But their plan had failed, and most of the rice ended up damaged, leaving only 2 sections of the field. With a heavy heart, Mars told the werewolves to only harvest the rice they could and to burn the rest. One of them was surprised and tried to argue that there were still some good rice plants in the field, but Mars explained that if everything was affected by the blight, it could spread to the other fields. Therefore, they needed to stop the spread to avoid any more unnecessary damage. The werewolf boy left with a look of disappointment, doing as Mars had instructed. Everyone watched with sad expressions and drooping ears as the villagers had to see their hard work go up in smoke so easily. Yu approached Mars and tried to reassure him that everything would be all right, and he agreed. Shizuku also needed some comforting as she sat near the ashes with a sorrowful look on her face. She approached Mars and Yu to ask if they would be able to get through this. Mars placed a comforting hand on the werewolf girl's shoulder, assuring her that they would get through it all. Shizuku slapped both her cheeks to pull herself together. But perhaps she did it a little too hard, as her body began to tremble slightly from the pain. Mars turned to the alchemist girl, asking Angelina if she knew the cause of all the infected rice paddies. Angelina approached a grain of rice and immediately realized the disease was caused by a fungus-like substance, which meant burning the affected rice plants was the only way to deal with it. Even though the water channels were divided, the risk of the fungus spreading to the other rice fields was not small. She said that there seemed to be a type of fungal plant growing near the water's surface, weakening the rice plant's roots, so they needed to quickly pull them out if there were still many near the fields. Mars understood the situation and knew this was a heavy loss for them. However, fortunately, he knew the cause and the remedy for the future, so he would try to protect the 2 remaining rice fields. Unfortunately, one of the werewolves suddenly rushed into the area panting, trying to inform Mars and the others that there was a problem. He explained that an army was heading toward them from the eastern grasslands, numbering over 500 men, and the symbol on their flag was the exact same one as the Burman groups, which meant Duke Abik was coming. Mars lowered his head, a shadow falling over him, while Asagi asked what he would do next. Mars finally spoke, telling Shizuku to call Burman and the others back from faraway Azure, while the rest were to find any weapons they could use. Yue and Asagi were told to prepare a temporary command post at Mars's house, as he declared that it was time to prepare for war. The large army advanced into the area, wondering if there really was a rebel army in a place like this, and whether it was appropriate to bring such a large force against werewolves. But golems suddenly began to rise from the ground, causing the soldiers to stop in their tracks in shock. Another soldier told the rest not to panic, as their commander had warned them about the possibility of golems appearing. Everyone began to prepare the cannons. Angelina sat on a nearby tree, observing the battle, feeling slightly impressed to see the soldiers quickly regain their composure after all the confusion. She knew it would be difficult to deal with them without hurting them, but she would do her best, as it was her responsibility. Meanwhile, in the town of Kinui, the rest of the army was still advancing on the werewolf village. But the residents here were still utterly confused about what the Duke's army was doing here. One person wondered if it was because of the girl they had heard about, and another confirmed it, but said he'd heard that a demi-human named Shizuku was gathering allies to try and destroy those who had made her suffer. Renono cut through the chatter and asked the men why they were standing around talking, telling them they should be spending their time packing. In just a few seconds, the men had run off, but Renono was still surprised to see the Duke's army actually here, and couldn't blame everyone for their shock, as this was the first time this had ever happened. Renono wondered what Mars and Shizuku were doing, but her thoughts were cut short by a resident shouting for everyone to look in a certain direction, as the White Phoenix Night Order entered the town. The scarred man said that among the 7 Night Orders, they were the fastest. But Renono knew they were also extremist demi-human hunters, controlled directly by the central government, and were the enforcers of human supremacy. The man stated they had received reports of a demi-human uprising in the town, and it was clear that there were demi-humans living in Kinui. At this, the residents of Kinui began to murmur among themselves about how they were going to be saved. Suddenly, Garen stepped up to the knight and tried to flatter him, saying that there was no need for them to waste their precious time coming here. Renono tried to stop Garen, but the bald man stood his ground, as Garen disliked demi-humans. He still didn't want any trouble before he could make a profit. A darkness fell over the knight's face as he said that those who collude with demi-humans would face punishment, and then he proceeded to sever Garen's arm. This caused Renono to run over to the short man and tie off his shoulder to stop the bleeding. She asked the knight why he would cut down a human, and he explained that the demi-human's code of conduct was harmful to humanity, and that in the eyes of the law, humans and demi-humans are not equal. That is why the 36 knights will purge the town to ensure that no one trusts demi-humans. The knight prepared to strike Renono again, when something shattered his blade, leaving him bewildered. Everyone saw Shizuku protecting the 2, her skill activated and her mana level at 81,937. Garen got up with a look of joy, asking the werewolf girl if she had come to save him. But Shizuku, angered by his perception, kicked him away, sending him crashing into a nearby wall and knocking him unconscious. She told him to stay put if he was in too much pain to run. Renono turned to the other humans and screamed for them to run, as the knights were planning to kill them. Finally, they listened and began to flee, while the knight in front maintained a cold gaze and said it was a crime to make the people run away. Renono told Shizuku to run now, because they would kill her. But the werewolf girl knew they were there to kill demi-humans, as she had heard everything from Burman. Shizuku mocked that perhaps the knights really couldn't tell the difference between humans and others if they were trying to kill Renono and the rest. Renono tried to convince Shizuku to flee, until Shizuku said it was all for the sake of their king. The knight was handed a spear and said it was disappointing that she was just a little beast, but Shizuku asserted that she was not alone. Many werewolves began to flood into the town, surrounding the knights with everyone holding weapons at the ready. The knights were unfazed and unworried, still confident that they were stronger than the wolves. They said they really needed to purge those who saw demi-humans as equals. Shizuku roared at them, saying she was sick of humans like them, and then powered up her skill to 367,895. Mars sensed the power radiating from the girl as he looked out over the grassy fields, with Golem standing guard. He smiled to himself, realizing Shizuku had been holding back from the start, and he knew he could count on both Shizuku and Angelina to protect everything. Mars had heard the story about the Night Order who had killed a man just for giving a demi-human a piece of bread, and he had thought it was just a rumor at first. But after what had happened, perhaps it wasn't entirely false. The worst-case scenario would be the complete annihilation of the werewolves, and since they couldn't live freely outside the village, having it invaded meant total destruction for them. During the cultivation planning phase, he had predicted that the Night Order would appear after the demi-humans had gathered, but now there was a chance they would go to Kanui first because of that thought. Mars was heading towards Kanui, but Shizuku, Yue, and Angelina all told him that there was no need to fight, and that he could leave Kanui and the village to the three of them. A good king must always consider the worries of his subjects, and with that in mind, Mars began to realize that the job of a king was truly difficult. He muttered to himself and sensed someone approaching, deciding not to let on that he had noticed, and continued to speak. Suddenly, the person attacked, but a golem shielded him from the blow with its body. Mars crossed his arms and said it had been a while. When the dust settled, Ultra was revealed. As expected, Ultra seemed excited to have finally found Mars, and Mars noticed the expression, saying it was a fitting look for someone from a group that had fallen into the mud after revealing their true colors. The long-haired knight told Mars to shut up as he activated his holy sword skill, successfully creating a small cut on Mars's face. Mars was impressed to see that Ultra had improved since last time and asked what he had been doing. But Ultra just continued trying to attack Mars. The black-haired man asked where the other three were, but Ultra replies that there's no point in caring about them, explaining that Gordon has locked himself in his room, and Tina is nowhere to be found, and Elia has also disappeared after her meeting with the Duke. Ultra continues, saying he doesn't intend to let Mars escape again. Mars asks why Ultra is always targeting him and what his purpose is for coming here. Ultra screams that it's to take everything back from Mars. A shadow falls over Mars's face, as he says it's a relief to see that Ultra is still the same as ever. But Ultra pays no mind to Mars's words and lunges forward, ready to carve another wound into the black-haired man. Suddenly, Mars activates the Seraph's blessing, causing Ultra to recoil in confusion upon seeing that Mars has fully recovered, and threatens Ultra, telling him he should try for his head next. Ultra grows even more frustrated that Mars has learned to heal himself, noting that it's even better than Tina's. Mars asks if this means Ultra is giving up. Ultra lunges at Mars again, intending to decapitate him, but he realizes Mars is still alive, and tries to strike again, but it's useless. As Mars keeps regenerating, Mars begins to realize why Ultra can move better with Sword Saint, even without Hawkeyes, which makes him feel frustrated. Ultra pulls out something to shoot at Mars, but Mars uses his Cositus skill to freeze the arrow, along with Ultra's feet, holding him in place. Mars realizes it's an iron arrow with a poisoned tip, and remarks that the old Ultra would never have used something like a crossbow. Ultra tries to argue that Mars knows nothing about his skills, but Mars insists that he does, and that he was also the first one to notice Sword Saint's peculiar weakness, saying that it surpasses the user's perception and goes out of control because it's too fast. That's why he lent Ultra his Hawkeyes to enhance his kinetic vision, but now that Ultra has lost it, he can't control his body's speed and is afraid of crashing into walls or the ground. Even so, Ultra is still fighting with greater power than before, leading Mars to conclude and ask if Ultra is using drugs to push himself to his limits. After a moment of silence, Ultra laughs and says that Mars guessed correctly. He pulls out a small pill and says it's very effective, though expensive. Ultra explains that it was truly difficult to keep up with Angelina, and he had to erase his pain and use Sword Saint to pursue her, declaring that he has become stronger. Thanks to all the hardships he's endured, he says that he has been through more than Mars and should be the one to get everything in the end. But Mars says Ultra should have other options. He admits that Ultra was born with responsibilities he could never understand, but Mars says that relying on drugs isn't a good strategy. Ultra ignores Mars's words, smashing his foot free from the ice, and lunging at Mars to try and slash him again. Mars activates an indestructible shield on the golem, leaving Ultra bewildered. Mars asks if he should call it obsidian. Ultra calls all of Mars's actions impossible, but Mars says that many things in this world exist even though people think they're impossible. Mars asks if Ultra has realized something, and says that all the skills he's used in this battle were his, saying that if Ultra hadn't tried to kill him, those skills would have belonged to Ultra. The long-haired knight tries to say that Mars is wrong, until Mars cuts him off by raising a hand. And Mars says he's now going to take the last thing Ultra has left, daring him to try and stop him if he can. Meanwhile, in the center of Kanui Town, Shizuku is bleeding from her injured arm and is starting to struggle against the knights. All the werewolves are also struggling as they grow more exhausted and their weapons begin to fail. The knights declare that they fight humanely, claiming that having a noble will is what separates humans from demi-humans. Shizuku says those words aren't very convincing coming from someone who tried to kill another human, especially when there's nothing noble about a poisoned spearhead. She notices her mana is fading and wonders if it's because of the poison. The knight confirms it, explaining that the poison is a drug normally used as a painkiller, but it has the side effect of disrupting mana flow. He calls it the perfect drug to use against the werewolf's physical enhancements and armor skills, which makes Shizuku wary of how much this knight knows. She asks him how he knows about it. Tuichi admits that he was the one who developed the tactics that once wiped out the werewolf warriors. Shizuku retorts that it's pathetic for knights to brag about such things in front of an enemy, but he replies that they don't attack cowardly from the shadows like her kind. His words infuriate her, and she screams at him not to insult her ancestors. She realizes the situation is getting dire and tries to rein in her emotions, knowing that everyone will be in danger if she doesn't calm down. Shizuku feels as if she could never face Mars again, if she were to betray his trust. The knight laughs and tells her to show him her honor and pride. He asserts that the knights and humans never told the werewolves to die or leave, but only asked them not to disturb others while they were trying to do good. He twists the story to make it sound like the werewolves were the ones who started the war. Shizuku is confused by the knight's words, as the history she was taught was the complete opposite. Her ancestors fought and died with pride. She knows she has to say something, but the words just won't come out. The knight closes in on her. And when she threatened him again, he just looked at her with disappointment, saying she didn't understand her own situation. Suddenly, a jar was thrown at the knight by Renono, making him furious. He wondered why commoners had such strong feelings for demi-humans. He declared that the world would be better if people just understood things properly. Shizuku tried to stop Renono, but she stomped on a box and shouted that she was just like the knights, who had seen Garen and Eldora bully Shizuku and done nothing, because she wasn't brave enough to risk her own life. But that was in the past, and now she had realized that she didn't know all the details, but one thing she knew for sure was that she didn't like these knights at all, and she continued to throw more things at the knight's face. He called her pathetic and threw a knife at her, aiming straight for her heart. She realized she wouldn't be able to dodge it in time, thinking she was dead, until Garen suddenly pushed her out of the way, calling her an idiot. The knight just scoffed, while Garen told her that he had repaid his debt, and now they were even, making Renono smile gently at his words. Shizuku saw some water on the ground and tried to wash her arm with it, believing it could remove the poison. The knight said it was useless, but there was something he didn't know. The werewolf girl's arm began to heal, surprising her that the knight didn't know about her ability, even though he had investigated her thoroughly. Shizuku explained that her power grows stronger when she fights for others. She stood up, her mana activity level reaching 33,301,470, leaving the knight staring in disbelief. Then she lunged forward and killed one of the knights, to save a child who was apparently still in the town. The knight thought that her unique skill was dependent on the land, but Shizuku explained that something had been awakened, and proceeded to let her skill bite into his arm. She landed on the ground and ordered all the werewolves to stand up, showing their pride and strength to the enemy. This made everyone stand up within seconds, while the knights began to charge, confident they would win due to their numerical advantage. However, the numerical advantage actually belonged to Shizuku, as all the citizens who had fled earlier now returned with weapons and the courage to help. Renono knew the knights thought it was foolish to cooperate with demi-humans, but she didn't care. She asked Shizuku if the townspeople could join the battle, and the girl replied that they could do whatever they wanted. Renono picked up the dagger that had been thrown earlier and pointed it at the knights, saying she didn't like them and asked if everyone agreed. The entire crowd roared in agreement, shouting for the knights not to touch Kanui as they charged into battle.